Chapter 11. Heading home finally, I told myself to try to calm down. I was determined to help Sarah get over her trauma, though truthfully I was too tired to really think straight at that moment. So instead, I decided to let everything rest for a few hours and try for some distance. In fact, I began imagining myself in a hot bath, gazing at my now wilting roses. Home, sweet home. Mine was a standard one-bedroom in a building that had been turned into a co-op 5 years earlier, the owner offering the individual apartments to the tenants. I'd stayed a renter, however, passing up the low insider price, $138,000, because I didn't really have the money, and when I did have it someday, I would want something bigger. I wished I had more space. A real dining room and a bigger bathroom would do for starters, along with some place for more bookcases. And if a baby should someday miraculously come along, I'd often thought you could tell a lot about somebody from where and how they lived. It's revealing as a Rorschach test. What, I often wondered, did my apartment say about me? A decorator might conclude I'd done up the place with love, then easily let it go. They'd decide I cared about nice things, but once those nice things were there, I neglected them. It would be true. I'd covered the walls of the living room with pale blue cloth, then hung a lot of framed pictures and old movie posters. Okay, I like movies. For me, even the posters are art. My couch was an off-white, more like dirt-colored actually, and covered with pillows for the feminine touch. I'd hoped you'd have to look twice to realize it was actually a storage cabinet in disguise, with drawers along the bottom of the front. The floor was polished hardwood, rugs from India here and there, in sore need of a vacuuming, and even a couple of deceased insects that had been there for over a week. That sort of said it, I thought glumly. I'm a workaholic slob. The bedroom revealed even more about me. The bed was a brass four-poster, queen size, partly covered by an heirloom quilt. It hadn't been made in a week. Who has the time? The room itself was long and divided into areas for work and sleep. Opposite the bed itself was an antique English desk, on which sat my old Macintosh, and next to that was my file cabinet, the indispensable part, the home office the IRS loves to hate. On top of it was a stack of marked-up scripts, notes scribbled all over them in 6 different colors. You never realize movies are so complicated till you see a breakdown sheet. Camera angles and voiceovers, and next to the bed was a violin case and 3 books about Indian ragas. What was that about? Somebody might wonder, some kind of Indian music nut. I was, albeit a very minimally talented nut. The kitchen was the New York efficiency kind, painted a glossy tan, the color of aerosol olive oil. The cabinets contained mostly packages of pasta, instant soup, and coffee filters. Not even any real food. I live on deli takeout these days. An inventory of my fridge at this moment would clock 2 cartons of fresh squeezed orange juice, a half quart of spoiling milk, a bag of coffee beans, plastic containers of wilting veggies from the corner salad bar, and 3 bottles of New York seltzer. That was it. God help me, I thought, my mind state turning even more morose. This is my life. I had become that retrograde woman of the 90s, works 90 hours a week, makes 90 thou a year, weighs 90 pounds, and thinks, pardon my French, cooking and fucking are provinces in northern China. Well, the 90 pounds part of that obscene quip didn't fit, and it wasn't the 90s anymore anyway. In any case, was my apartment a place to raise a child? No earthly way, like Carly. I'd have to spring for some decent space, preferably with a washing machine. A parking slot was open right in front of my building, a minor miracle on this day of uncertain events. As I was pulling in, I glanced over to see a man walking past, not catching the face but sensing something familiar in the walk. He was in the process of unbuttoning a Federal Express uniform, peeling away the top to reveal a dark suit. He certainly seemed to be in a big hurry, carrying an unmarked shopping bag. Maybe, I thought, his shift was over and he was meeting his wife or a friend. I wondered if he'd left a package for me and told myself to check with the super. Not the usual delivery guy, did they come on Sunday now? And also, where was the truck? They always parked right here by the building. I was still so upset over Sarah, I couldn't immediately process those illogical observations, so I just grabbed my pink roses, dripping from the bottom of their paper wrapping, and opened the car door. It was definitely good to be home. I loved my Chelsea neighborhood, where you got to know the locals, running into them. The delis, the little restaurants, the dry cleaners, just like a small town. If you worked at home the way I sometimes did, you even got to know the mailman and the delivery guys for UPS and FedEx. Hey, that guy, He placed the walk, a kind of a strut. He was the slimeball who'd been outside Paula Mark's building last week, carrying a gun and threatening me. What's he doing here? My pulse went off the charts. Was he one of Nicky Russo's Wise Guy crew? After all, had he come back with his pistol to pay me a return engagement, my God? Chill out, I told myself, take a deep breath. He's leaving. Just try and find out who he is. Roses in one hand held up awkwardly on my face, I slowly ambled down the street after him. I didn't have to go far. Within about 100 feet, he unlocked a long black Lincoln town car, stepped out of the FedEx camouflage, tossed it onto the seat along with the bag he was carrying, pulled the cap off his bald head, got in, and sped away. The license plate looked different from the usual, but I got what I needed, DL and a string of numbers. Oh, I thought, was he leaving a package bomb for me? I turned back and let myself into the outer lobby, glancing around as I did. There were no parcels anywhere, just blank brown tile. My apartment was 3A. The name on the bell was M. James. As I stepped through the inner lobbies, no package, a rumpled face appeared in the doorway just to my left. The sign on it, flaking, said super. Oh, hi. The voice was Patrick Mooney, our superintendent, who did not normally emerge to greet those arriving. But there had been complaints from the building's managing agent that he could never be found for emergencies, so he probably wanted to appear available, even on Sundays. His voice was slurred from some midday medicinal Irish whiskey. Thought you were? FedEx guy was here earlier looking for you. Oh boy, did he leave a package? He had something with him, if that's what you mean, like a bag of some kind. And you let him go up? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt a rush of dismay. Said he had to, needed a signature. Patrick Mooney then shrugged and reached for the duojam to steady himself, his whiskey breath wafting across the hall. Great security. I stepped into the elevator as the door was clanking. Shut, and watched as he rubbed his eyes and eased his own door closed. Now I was really puzzled. If the FedEx guy came earlier, why was he just now leaving? A lot of scary theories went through my mind as I pushed the button for the third floor. I took a deep breath as the elevator opened, but again I saw no packages. So far so good. Getting off, I set down my roses on the hall carpet and fumbled for my key. When I inserted it, the lock felt a little rough, causing me to think for an instant I'd used the wrong key, but then it responded. What had caused that? I wondered. Had the guy been fiddling with my door, wiring a bomb? Using one hand, I pushed it open, again holding my breath and standing aside, but it opened okay. I exhaled, then reached back to drag in the flowers. But if he didn't leave a package, what was he doing here? Casing out where I lived, planting a bug in the elevator. And why was he here so long? The place was dark when I stepped in, the drapes drawn. I relocked the door, then surveyed the gloom. No explosions, so I guessed he didn't plan to kill me. Yet, here I was, home, safe and sound. I just stood a minute, still uneasy. Then I remembered the flowers, my dripping bouquet, and headed for the kitchen. Deal with them, and then maybe get a bottle of white wine out of the fridge and sip some in the bath. After my unnerving sequence with Sarah, thoughts of going to the off had zero appeal. Time to lighten up, way up. Preoccupied, not looking around, I stuffed the roses into a vase by the sink, and then I thought again about the white wine and opened the refrigerator. I'd still not bothered to on any lights, but the kitchen and its ancient fridge were dimly illuminated by the tiny window just across. I wasn't sure where I'd put the bottle, since I'd had to rearrange things to make room for the dupe of Carly's interview. I was also planning to take home a safety dupe of Paula's interview sometime later in the week. Why was I doing that? Taking home copies. It was a sign of deep compulsion. You couldn't really make a professional quality second negate. If from a first positive by that time it would be third generation, but I'd brought it anyway. Now and then I just have a raw instinct that keeping a safety backup around is a good idea, but the canister had ended up devouring the end. Tire lower shelf of the fridge. I opened the white door and peered in. The light was out, and for a moment I stared numbly at the dark, half-filled shelves. The only thing that struck me as odd was that I could see the pure white of the empty bottom. Shelf, for a second I could only stand and stare, but then I backed away, trying to figure out what was wrong, and stumbled over something. I regained my balance and flipped on the overhead light. What? The floor around me was littered with bottles. My old toaster, my tiny microwave. It was a total shambles. I recoiled, stumbling again, this time over cans strewn across the linoleum. My kitchen, it was slowly sinking in, had been completely trashed. I felt a visceral wave of nausea. It's the scariest thing in the world, having your space invaded like a form of psychic rape. I sagged against the refrigerator as I gazed around. The cabinets had been emptied out, a hasty and haphazard search, quick and extremely dirty, as glass containers of condiments, including an old bottle of dill pickles, were shattered, and their contents smeared into the floor. I don't believe this. I marched back into the living room and reached for the lights. This room, too. It had been turned upside down. The TV, stereo, VCR, all had been swept onto the rug, but they were still there. That guy, that animal, who did this wasn't a thief. He'd been looking for something, my breath now coming in pulses. I edged into the bedroom and switched on the light. The bed was the way I'd left it, the covers thrown back and the pillows in a pile. The clock radio was there, and so was the old Mac still on the table in the far corner, my workstation. And nothing seemed to be missing. I headed back to the kitchen, where the refrigerator door was still open. I gazed at the interior a moment, still puzzled, trying to figure out what wasn't right. Shit. That's what was wrong. The field, white bottom shelf was empty. Totally empty. The film canister of Paula's interview was gone. For a moment I just leaned against the kitchen counter, barely pushing aside an impulse to throw up in the sink. Think, I told myself, get a grip and think. It was the film he'd wanted. And he'd wanted it badly enough to pick the lock, then rip my home apart looking for it. I pulled at a tangle of hair, feeling my mind in chaos, and tried to reason out the situation. Why? Why would he steal a positive that couldn't be used for anything? Finally, the real truth of what had happened hit me like a fist in the chest. My home, sweet home, had been violated. Seething, I went into the living room and reached for the phone, the only thing not on the floor. My first instinct was to call David, but then I decided he'd just go into a tizzy of hysteria and be no support at all. So instead I called Lou, praying I wouldn't wake Sarah. In an steady voice I tried to tell him what had happened. He seemed puzzled to hear from me again so soon, but then he quickly turned FBI, concerned for my safety. Guy sounds like a professional, he declared. Probably got in with an electric picker like the Edge. Any asshole can buy one for $130. It'll rake cylinders at 100 times a second. Pro like that, you can be sure there'll be no prints. But why would? My voice was still a crr. Oak, I mean, my God, all for a lousy reel of film? Fucker wants you to know he's in town, so how he did it's as important as what he did. It's a time-proven scare tactic. He paused. Morgan, I don't like this one bit. There. Would be more before this is over. Think I should call the cops? Damned right you should, he said, slowly and sadly. But to tell you the truth, they ain't gonna do all that much. Somebody messed up your apartment and lifted a third hand. Oppie of a woman talking. They'll say it sounds more like malicious mischief than a crime. Then they'll write it up and that'll be the last you'll hear from them. Well, I said, my anger welling up, maybe I don't feel quite so laissez-faire. Me, you know anybody who can run a plate for you on a Sunday. "You got the prick's license number," he exclaimed. "Why the hell didn't you say so?" "Honestly, it sort of slipped my mind. I'm having a little trouble thinking straight. It right now? Fortunately, my short-term memory is pretty good, even when I'm stressed, so I spewed it out. "Don't go anywhere," he declared. "I'll get back to you in 5 minutes." I hung up the phone and lay down flat out on the pit, trying a breathing exercise to calm down. The problem was, it wasn't working. Having had some experience with being robbed, I once got completely cleaned out when I had a ground-floor apartment down in the village. I know you go through certain Kubler-Ross-like stages of anger, denial, depression, acceptance. You also go through a predictable series of recriminations. I should have had window bars and gates. I should have had a different lock. I should have had 2 different locks. In the instance just recalled, I'm virtually certain an apartment painter duplicated a set of my keys on his lunch break and then passed them on to a second-story artist. No way to prove that, mind you, but it had to be. What happened? I also suspect he checked my appointment's calendar to see when I was going to be out of town. But in this case, the lock was definitely picked. Nobody had a set of my keys except the super and Steve. So the guy with the Spanish accent knew how to slip through doors, and he had no financial interest in my old VCR. He only had an interest in my film. What had he said there on the sidewalk outside Paula Marx's apartment? Something about how this picture was a big mistake. I jumped as the phone erupted by my ear. "The name Colonel Jose Alvino Ramos Grijalva mean anything to you?" Lou asked. "How could it? I'm not sure I can even pronounce it." "Well, Colonel Ramo declares himself to be a military attaché at the Guatemalan consulate here. You've got a big shot in the Guatemalan army rummaging through your apartment. This is even worse than I thought. Those guys are killers. Jesus." I was still coming to grips with the horrifying fact he'd been in my apartment, in my only refuge. Think I could bring charges against him? Well, let's consider this a minute. Probably no prints, no credible witness. You'd have a damned hard I'm proving anything, he sighed. Truth is, I doubt you could even get a restraining order, given what little you've got to work with. The bastard. I sat a moment, feeling the logical left side of my brain just shut down. My mind went back to its most primitive level, running on adrenaline. Look, I need to check out something. I'll call you in the morning. Well, be careful, he said warily. And for God's sake, don't go running off anyplace alone. I'm telling. You're not safe. Always be around people. I'll keep it in mind. With that, I gently hung up the phone and exhaled. Think, some colonel from Guatemala just broke into my apartment looking for what I might know about children. Of light, where I've been going to see about having a baby. So why is he so interested in what I'm doing? I remembered Alex Goddard wanted me to go to a clinic he had somewhere in Central America. 10-1, that clinic was in Guatemala. That was what this whole thing was about. And now he'd just gone back there. At least that was what he'd said. Guatemala was a long way off, but his other operation was right up the river. I hadn't seen all of it this morning. But that was about to change. A lot of things were about to change. It was time to start getting the playing field level again. Chapter 12. I arranged with Patrick Mooney to have his sister in Queens, a full-figured woman named Rosalind, come in and finish the job of reconstructing my wrecked home. She arrived an hour and a half later, and was hard at work when I left. I also agonized over the police report issue, but finally decided to forego the bother. Lou was right. It would be a 2-hour ordeal of futility. Besides, I had better things to do with my time. I was going to return the favor of an information-gathering expedition. Alex Goddard had said he'd be absent from Quetzal Manor, who knows for how long, and this time around I was going to do the place right, the next step in my undercover research. The first and main thing I wanted to do was explore the new high-tech clinic that sat nestled in the woods across from the old building. Everything about it was the exact opposite of a manor. Not a shred of new age spirituality, just a Out of digital equipment and ultrasound, and what else chief among my questions? What was behind that big white door? Maybe I was being impulsive, but I was completely wired, and the truth was, I wasn't going to sleep till I knew. A lot more than I did. And if I went late tonight, Sunday, I probably wouldn't have to deal with Ramallah. I called Roger Drexel, my unshaven cameraman, and asked him to come up and meet me at Applecore. It was Sunday, and he was watching the third quarter of a Knicks game and into his second six-pack, but he agreed. After all, I was his current boss. All I really wanted was his Betacam and some metal tape which would be broadcast quality. I'd wanted to do it yesterday, but now the time had definitely come. We met at the office, and he unlocked the room with the camera gear and loaded in a fresh tape. With any luck, he made it home for the end of the game. I then had a sinful cheeseburger and for eyes at a Greek diner 2 blocks down the avenue. It was my idea of a courage-bolstering indulgence. My watch reads 6:35, and daylight was waning when I revved my old Toyota and started my northbound trek back to Quetzal Manor. When I was passing the George Washington Bridge, the first drifting flakes of a freak late-season snowstorm began pelting my windshield. Good, I thought. Turning on my wipers, the less visibility, the better. At least I believed. Until the road started getting slippery, and I had to throttle back. It was only then I realized I'd been pushing 80 on the speedometer, passing a lot of cars. Lou's warning not to go anywhere alone was still filed in the back of my mind, but I kept trying not to think about it. Sometimes there are things you've just got to do. The highway grew more treacherous the farther north I went, but the traffic was thinning out, and by the time I reached the turnoff to Quetzal Manor, total darkness had set in addition to which the paving was covered with at least an inch of sparkling new pristine snow. As I eased up the roadway, my headlights made the trees around me glisten with their light dusting of white Ike frosting on the tips of a buzz cut. I switched off my lights as I made the last turn in the road, but not before catching a glimpse of Quetzal Manor, and I must confess to feeling a shudder, of both anger and apprehension, run through me as I watched its magisterial turrets disappear into the snowy dark. I parked my car at the back of the lot and retrieved the flashlight I'd brought, a yellow plastic 2-battery model. I hadn't realized there'd be snow when I left home, so I was just wearing some old sneakers, but they'd do. I then sat there in the dark for a long minute, listening to the silence and thinking. The first thing was to find out if anybody was guarding the place. The next was to get some video of the new building. I grabbed the bag carrying the Betacam, tested my flashlight against the floorboard, and then headed up the snowy driveway. I marched straight through the open arch that was the front door, and I was again in the drafty hallway where I'd met Ramallah Saturday morning. It was empty and dark now, no lights anywhere, not even out in the courtyard beyond. The stony quiet, no music, no chants felt unnatural, but it also suggested that Alex Goddard's adoring acolytes were safely tucked away. Early to bed, you know the rest, so maybe I really had come at the right time. A chilly wind was blowing in from the far end of the hallway, and I felt like I'd just entered a dank too. But I tightened my coat and pressed on. When I got to the end and looked out, the snowy courtyard was like a picture postcard. And completely empty. All right, I thought, move on to what you came for. But when I turned and headed down the hallway toward the entry arch, I caught a glimpse of a furtive form, dark and shadowy, lurking just outside. Shit! I froze in my tracks, but then the figure stepped inside, wearing something that made me think of Little Red Riding Hood like a tiny ghost in a cowl. It was Tara, Alex Goddard's spacey waif, who was moving so oddly, I thought for a moment she might be sleepwalking. She wasn't, of course. She'd just been out strolling around the driveway. In the snow. I soon realized she lived her life in something resembling a trance, as though she were a permanent denizen of the spirit world. For her it was a natural condition. It's so beautiful like this, she mumbled dreamily, as though we'd been in the middle of a lifelong conversation. I just love it. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence, it seemed to ricochet off the stone walls. "I want to take them out, show them God's paintbrush. Will you help me?" "Take who out?" I asked, immediately deciding to go with the moment. Finally, she looked directly at me and realized whom she'd been talking to. "You were here before. I tried to give you herbs to help you, but then he came and her." Ois trailed off as she walked back through the portico and out again into the drifting snow. Then she held up her hands, as though attempting to capture the flakes as keepsakes. "I so want to show them. They've never seen it before." She glanced back at me. "Come on, let's do it." As I followed her out into the drifting white and across the parking lot, the accumulation of snow was growing denser, enough now to start covering the cars, but still, something told me the flurry was going to be short-lived. I took a long, misty breath of the moist air and clicked open the case holding the Betacam, readying myself to take it out the minute we got inside. Well, I thought, maybe I've gotten lucky. She was headed for the new clinic, which was exactly where I wanted to go. It was nestled in the trees up a winding pathway, and as I slogged along I could feel the snow melting through my sneakers. When we got to the front door, large and made of glass, she just pushed it open. "We never lock anything," she declared, glancing back. "It's one of our rules." The hallway was dark, silent, and empty except for the two of us. Still, I felt a tinge of caution as we entered. At some level this was trespassing. "Come on," she said, casually flipping a switch on the right-hand wall and causing the overhead fluorescence to blink on. "He's away now and everybody's in bed, but I'll bet they're still awake in here. It's a perfect time." I didn't feel anything was perfect, but I did know I wanted to learn what was behind the door I'd seen when I was leaving. It was at the end of the hallway, wide and steel and painted hospital white. And sure enough, that was exactly where Tara was heading. She just kept talking nonstop in her dreamy little girl voice. "We've got to try and make them understand it's okay, that it'll be just for a minute." She shoved open the door without knocking, and my ears were greeted by the faint strains of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, one of my favorites. For an instant, I was caught up in the music, a poignant moment drawing me in. The room itself was spacious, with a row of white bassinets along one side, and subdued lighting provided by small fluorescent bulbs along the walls. It was, I immediately realized, a no-frills nursery. Alongside the bassinets were tables with formula and boxes of Pampers and handy wipes. Two short men of indefinable nationality, they looked vaguely Asian, were in attendance, and at the moment, one was facing away and bouncing a baby on her shoulder. Her infant looked like a boy, or was that just my imagination? And I felt my heart go out. The light was dim, but I could tell he was a gorgeous, sandy-haired kid, plump and peaky, so sublime in his tender vulnerability as he gazed around with eyes full of trust. He was staring directly back at me, and before I could stop myself, I gave him a little wave and wrinkled my nose. He stared at me a second, then responded with a tiny smile. "Hey," I thought, "I've got the touch." "Come on," Tara said, ignoring the women. "Let me show you. They're all so beautiful." By then my eyes were adjusting to the subdued light, and as we walked down the middle of the long room, I confirmed my assumption that the bassinets next to the tables all contained infants. I'm no expert on babies, but I'd guess they were all around 6 weeks old, maybe a couple of months at most. This is the nest, I thought. Ground zero. Kevin and Rachel were both probably in this room at one time too. "Aren't they wonderful?" Tara was saying, still in her squeaky, spaced-out voice. I was opening the Betacam bag when the first woman, the one holding and lightly bouncing her little boy, absently put her hand under his quilt, then spoke to the other in deeply accented English. "He's wet again." It was the first words either of them had uttered. Then she turned to me in exasperation, assuming, I suppose, that I was one of Alex Goddard's flock. "And I just changed him." Again the accent, but I still couldn't identify it. She made a face, then carried him over to a plywood changing table in the center of the room. I felt a great baby yearning as I moved over beside her, but she was behaving like a typical hourly wage earner, glumly going about her job, and I just stood there a moment, vainly wanting to hold him, then turned back to Tara. "Where do all these children come from?" "Ramallah says they are orphans or abandoned or something. from overseas or wherever. They're so perfect. He was completely zombied out, felt like talking to a marshmallow on downers. But how exactly do people bring them here? She seemed uninterested in the question, just plunging on as she wandered off. Down the line of bassinets. I'd finally come to my senses enough to take out the Betacam, though the light wasn't actually enough to really work with, certainly not broadcast quality. She stopped and picked up one of the infants out of its bassinet, then turned back to me, her eyes turning soft as she hugged it the way she might a small puppy. "Isn't this one cute? I'd so love to have him." Was she on some kind of drug that suppressed curiosity? I found myself wondering as I panned the camera around the room. There must have been at least 20 bassinets, all just alike, wicker with a white lace hood. A couple of the babies were sniffling, and the one Tara had picked up now began crying outright, much to her annoyance. The room itself smelled like baby powder. "And then what happens?" I asked finally, zooming in on one of the women. "What happens when?" Now Tara was twirling in a circle, humming futilely to the shrieking child. "You mean after they come here?" "Right." God, getting answers from her was making me crazy. "The girls here take them to their new mothers." Her eyes had turned even more dreamy as she lightly bounced the bawling bundle she was holding one last time, after which she returned it to its bassinet. Then she gazed around the room. "It's so sad to see them leave. Did Paula and Carly get their babies that way?" I found myself wondering. Probably, but it was one more thing I'd neglected to ask. "Come on," Tara continued. "Let's take some of them out. He makes the nurses try and speak English around the children, but they don't really know much. Maybe you could figure out a way to, like, explain." "Tara, I don't think taking any of these babies out into the snow is a very hot idea. Not tonight. Maybe in the morning." Stall her, I thought. She's completely out of it. Then I looked at the woman changing the baby. Sure enough, I was right. It was a boy, but I want to. Tara turned crestfallen. "To show them how beautiful, well, I don't speak whatever language they're speaking," I said, cutting her off. "I'm not even sure I could make it sound reasonable in English. So you'll have to do it without my help." Then I turned to the woman who'd been changing the baby. "Do you know where this child came from?" Why not take a shot? She just stared at me, alarmed, then turned away. Nothing. She clearly wasn't going to tell me anything, even if she could. She and the others were just cheap hired help, probably illegal immigrants without a green card and scared to death for their jobs. They weren't going to be doing an in-depth tell-all. Well, to anybody. I thought about the situation for a moment and decided I'd seen what I came to see. This was pay dirt. Alex Goddard was running a full-scale adoption mill, just as Lou had suspected. He was collecting beautiful white babies from overseas or wherever, and selling them here at $60,000 a pop, which went a long way toward explaining why he didn't want Children of Light to be featured in my film. And the Guatemalan colonel, who just trashed my home, was almost certainly in on the operation. Alex Goddard might be a New Age miracle worker rediscovering ancient Native American herbal cures, but he also was running a very efficient money machine. Still, the big question kept coming back. Where did he get all the babies? To extract any more information about that from Quetzal Manor, I'd have to break into an office somewhere, and I wasn't quite up to that yet. I didn't have the nerve of Colonel Jose y Alvino Ramos. Tell you what, Tara, I think I'm out of here. I was returning the Betacam to its bag. Nothing I'd shot was remotely broadcast quality, but I did have proof of what was going on. My undercover investigation was making some headway. Okay. She sighed, her expression increasingly glazed. I took one last look around the room at the row of bassinets, then gave her a parting pat and headed for the exit. "Look," I said, turning back as I reached the door. "Don't say anything to anybody about me being here tonight, okay? Can we just let it be our secret?" "Sure, whatever," she shrugged absently. "Like, why not? And Tara, do yourself a favor, get out of this place." "But there's nowhere else I can go," she said, sadness in her eyes. As I slowly closed the door, the last thing I heard was the sound of the Beethoven sonata dying away. What a day and night. As I walked down the hallway carrying the camera bag, I tried to process my new information. I'd just seen some of the most incredibly lovable babies ever. That part of it was a beautiful experience, one that pulled at my heartstrings more strongly than I'd ever imagined something like that. The part that troubled me was the babies were so alike, so fair, and they all could have been perfect siblings for Kevin and Rachel. No, I told myself, surely that was my imagination. Though they did look amazingly related. As I moved across the parking lot, I thought I saw a movement in the shadows just inside the entry archway, a quick change in the pattern of dark. Was it Rimala or one of the girls, I wondered? Or was it just my paranoia, keep walkie? I told myself, lose yourself in the snow. The only way they can stop you from exposing this racket now is to kill you. When I got back to my car, I gazed up at the imposing turrets of Quetzal Manor one last time, wishing there was enough light to film them, and collected my thoughts. Was the story about the babies being orphans or abandoned children or whatever really true? I didn't believe it, not for a minute. But as Carly Grove said, Alex Goddard could, May. It could happen. The problem for me was he wouldn't tell me where he got the children, and nobody I'd talked to so far seemed to want to know, not really. I wanted to know. Chapter 13. In moments I was heading down the snowy drive, south toward my home, which had been hopefully put back together. I pushed the pace mesmerized by the snow and tried to decide what to do next. The thug Ramos had stole, and some second-generation interview footage from me. But now I had a tape of something a lot more interesting. When I pulled into my street, the time was just past 11, and I was thinking about calling Lou or Steve or both. But then I saw something odd. A woman was walking down the steps from the lobby of my building, a woman I recognized from somewhere. Her hair was tangled, and she was wearing black jeans and a black sweater. It took a second before I finally processed the fact it was Carly Grove, and she seemed frantic. I assumed she'd come in a cab, but she had my home phone number, so why would she come over if I didn't answer? New Yorkers don't just drop in. A social no-no, maybe. The reason had something to do with how she looked. I felt like I was seeing a specter. "Thank God you're here," she blurted out, striding up. She was actually shaking, and I could tell she'd been crying. Nothing like the gutsy woman I'd see a few days earlier. "I kept getting your machine, but I thought maybe you were hiding." I looked at her and forgot all about my own issues. It was hard to remember ever seeing a human being in such distress, except for Sarah. Why would I be hiding? I was taking out the Betacam bag and closing my car door, hoping to seem normal and professional. "They called me about 6 o'clock tonight. Children of Light." She could barely get the words out. "They'd seen." "I interview with you. How did they get it?" I looked down at the snowy make that slushy street and felt a chill go through me, followed immediately by anger. Ramos, that bastard. Somebody took a copy this morning. Stated like that. It sounded pretty lame. "I'm so sorry," he threatened Kevin. "He actually said if I signed a release to let you use the film, my child would meet with an accident. And then he said something about you, that your own, who called? You, did he tell you his?" He wouldn't give a name, just some man. He had a foreign accent. She threw her arms around me, and I hugged her back as best I could. "Where's Kevin now?" I was so concerned about Carly that I'd repressed the information that he'd also mentioned me. Marcy was there, so I told her to take him with her, to her mother's place in the Bronx, where she lives. Carly was still trembling as she loosened her grip on me. "I called a car, sir. If it's to drive them up." "Well, come on in. Let's talk." Truthfully, I wasn't sure how much I wanted to tell her about what I'd just seen at Quetzal Manor. It would probably just distress her more. Where had Kevin come from? Did I really want to delegitimize him in her eyes? As I led her through the lobby, hoping to appear composed, Patrick Mooney greeted us, announcing that his sister, Rosalind, had been gone for an hour, and that she appreciated my memorable tip. The pull. Ace looked like nothing had happened, and Carly immediately collapsed onto my earth-tone couch. I hadn't told her my apartment had been tossed along with the robbery, and, thanks to Rosalind, I didn't need to. In fact, it actually looked cleaner than it had in months. Maybe, I thought, I should reprioritize my life and hire her more often. Then I got a glass of water for Carly and sat down next to her. "I'm really sorry," I began, deeply meaning it. "If I'd known all this was going to happen, I'd never—" "It's not your fault." She took a long drink. I hadn't bothered with ice, and I immediately felt I'd been inhospitable, kind of a vagrant, minor concern, considering. Then she went on. "I guess I knew down deep I shouldn't have given you that interview, but I wanted the world to know about Kevin. Now, though, should I call the police or something?" The short answer to that was yes, but my mind was already skipping on to a different topic. "Carly, do you know where Kevin came from? Really came from? Did you ever actually try to find out?" She sighed and took another sip. "I told you I don't care. When they brought him, all pink and helpless, I just— Who brought him?" I interrupted. "Well, I'd been up there the day before, signing all the papers. I was supposed to go up that day, but then somebody called and said one of the girls who was staying in the clinic, or whatever it is, was bringing him to me." So don't come. You're saying one of the girls?" "Yeah." She looked wistful for a moment, as though remembering. "Then she just showed up, looked like some blonde college dropout. I guess a little more fanfare would have been nice, but Mars, he was there to help me, and that was it. That's the last contact I ever had with children of light." She shuddered involuntarily. "Till now. Well, I thought the last thing I'm going to do is tell her about what I just saw. She's the ideal customer for Alex Goddard. She truly doesn't want to know details. Carly, there's not much I can do about what's already happened, but I can try to keep you from getting into any more trouble. Why don't you call them in the morning and tell them you've yelled at me and rescinded your permission for AppleCore to use the film? And say I've promised I won't. You've threatened to sue me or something. That should get you off the hook." "You really think so?" Her look brightened slightly. "Yes, it's me they're worried about, not you. I represent some threat to them because of the film I'm making. Just bail out and you'll be okay." "Thanks. I did get the feeling that's all they really want." She took another drink of water. "But if they wanted to scare me, they're doing a hell of a good job." "Well then, why not take Kevin and go away for a couple of weeks, on a vacation someplace, and while you're doing that, I'm going to have a one-on-one with Alex God. I've got a little leverage now." She looked at me. What are you going to do?" I couldn't tell her about my videotape of his baby Cash without explaining a lot more about children of light than I thought she wanted to hear. "Don't you think the less you know the better?" I said, taking her hand. "I've caused you enough trouble already." "No, I caused myself trouble." She was getting up. "Can I use your bathroom?" "Sure." I pointed the way. While she was gone, I went to the kitchen and surveyed it, checking the cabinets. Again, the place was cleaner than it had been in ages. The look of it momentarily bucked me up. When Carly came back, she hugged me and then announced she wanted to go check on Kevin. "You'll do what you said about calling them," she concluded, reaching for her bag. "I think you're right. That ought to get them off my case, at least for the moment. As for the long run, Carly," I said, taking her hand again, "we'll get through this. Just trust me." We hugged one more time, and then she was gone. I took the moment to double-lock the door and then collapsed on the couch. What should be my next move? I closed my eyes and tried to review all the insidious things that had happened in the last 24 hours. The illegal drugs, the break-in and theft of my film, the suspicious nursery of children of light, the threats to Carly. Then it finally came back that she'd mentioned Ramos saying something about me. Bye. Now I was getting used to being threatened by the man, so one more time was hardly news. But I wished I'd asked her the specifics. That was when I roused myself and reached for the phone. The time was pushing 11, but I still wanted a check-in on Sarah, see how she was doing. Had she come back to reality after I left? I was listening to the phone ring, my mind drifting to thoughts of how to gently ask Lou about her, when I realized nobody was picking up. What's going on? I wondered, immediately coming alert. Mrs. Riley had probably gone home for the day, but no way would Lou be in bed before midnight. He always had trouble settling into sleep. Maybe, I then hoped. I just dialed the wrong number, but when I tried again, still no answer. I clicked off the phone and felt a wave of concern. If Colonel Jose Alvino Ramos could find out I was making a movie and then find out where I lived, he sure as hell could locate my extended family. Was that what he'd meant when he mentioned me to Carly? I grabbed the set of Lou's keys I had stored in my bedroom's desk drawer and flew out the door. The streets were plastered with a grimy veneer of city snow. Melting fast, but I pushed the limits of safety and ran a couple of lights since the traffic was spotty. There was a parking space just across the street from Lou's building, and as I pulled in, I looked over at his windows. Through the curtains, I could tell a dim light was on, probably coming from Sarah's bedroom. The front room, however, was dark. My pulse was pounding as I raced up the steps to the street door. I thought about pushing his bell, but I didn't have the patience. Instead, I just fumbled with the key set till I found the biggest one and shoved it into the lock. The building had no lobby, just a row of stairs leading up to the next floor with Lou's own door set off to the left. I shoved his Medico key into the deadlock and pushed it open. The room was pitch dark. "Who?" said a startled voice, and I knew it was Lou, somewhere in the direction of the couch. I clicked on the light switch and saw him lying on the floor, leaning against the couch, blood everywhere, his eyes in shock. My God, what happened? I'm afraid to move. The phone was ringing and I figured it was you, but I didn't dare get up, knowing you'd come over if I didn't answer. He was holding his side as he looked at me. "Morgie, she's gone." At first what he said didn't sink in as I bent over him. The right side of his shirt, just above his belt, was soaked in blood. Taking care, I unbuttoned it and saw an open cut that looked as though he'd been stabbed with a knife. It also appeared to be reasonably superficial, as though a thin blade had pierced through a couple of layers of tread on his ample spare tire. But it was bleeding still, enough to make it look worse than it probably was. However, if it had happened to me, I'd doubtless be in shock too. I got up, went to the bathroom, and pulled 2 towels off the rack, then doused water over one and came back. "Don't move. I'm going to pull your shirt away and try to clean you up, see? How bad it is?" He just groaned and stared at the ceiling. As I was swabbing his side, what he'd said finally registered. "Did you say Sarah?" I dropped the towels and ran into the bedroom. It was empty, the bed rumpled and beige sheets on a floor. "No." I turned and, feeling a hit of nausea, hurried back to his side. "What happened? Did?" "Fat Hispanic guy, spick bastard. He had a couple of young punks with him. Mrs. Riley had just left and I went to the door, thinking he was probably you ringing my bell. He flashed a knife and they shoved their way in. Then one of his thugs went into the bedroom and carried her out. When I tried to stop them, the SOB knifed me. I guess I swooned cause the next thing I remember is waking up here on the floor. It sounded garbled and probably didn't occur as quickly as he thought. But I knew immediately what had happened. Ramos, of course, that's who it was, had come to take Sarah. It was his one sure way to stop me from mentioning Children of Light in my film. She was a hostage. My first instinct was to kill him. What else can you remember? I was already dialing 911. Time to get an ambulance. And after that, the ops. After about 10 rings, I got somebody, and following an explanation that was longer than it needed to be, a woman with a southern accent told me the medics would be there in 15 minutes. I took another look at Lou and ordered them to hurry, then hung up. I was going to call the police next, but first I needed to hear exactly what had happened before he got quarantined in some emergency room. His eyes were glazing over again, as shock and blood loss start. It to catch up with him. Clearly he would pull through, but right now, sitting there in a pool of blood, he could have been at death's door. Look at that. He was pointing, his rationality beginning to fail. For a second I didn't realize what he meant. But then I saw a fax lying beside the phone. I picked it up. The time on it was 9:08 p.m., and it was from somebody named John Williams. Then I remembered. Wasn't that the FBI computer whiz he'd talked about the other? At the hospital, after we deconstructed Sarah's waterlogged passport. There was no message, just a sheet with a date 2 years old and a list of names accompanied by numbers and a capital letter. Then, I noticed the letterhead of Ave. Iatka, the Guatemalan national airline, and it dawned on me I was looking at a flight manifest. I scanned down the page and then I saw it. Sarah Crenshaw, 3B. Williams found her, I thought, and she was traveling first class. What? Caught my eye next was the name of the person sitting in 3A, the seat right next to hers. A. Godford, probably a computer misprint. Or maybe it was the name he used when he traveled. So if it was him, which it surely was, Esther didn't even try to hide it. I just stood there thinking, maybe you get one big-time coincidence in life, and if so, this must be mine. Sarah and I had both found Alex Goddard, or he'd found us. Other women came and went through Quetzal Manor, but we were different. She'd escaped from him, half dead, but now he'd sent Ramos to bring her back. It was the one way he could be sure to keep me under his control. But again, why? Was it just to stop my fill? Or was there more to the story? Morgie, Lou groaned. That son of a bitch took her tonight. I just know it. That was my conclusion precisely, though I hadn't been planning to say it to him, at least not yet. How can you be so sure? Something they said. I didn't quite catch it, but it sounded like he wants you back. Then some word. It sounded like Babylon or something. I stared at him a second, trying to remember where I'd heard that before. Then it clicked in. That was the last thing Sarah had said. She'd whispered that word when I was putting her to bed. What could she have been talking about? He wheezed, and I went back to him and pressed the towel against his side. The bleeding was about stemmed, but he was definitely due for a hospital stay. A siren was sounding down the street, probably the ambulance. Thank God, I thought. Now it's time to call the police. Then I noticed he was crying. What was that about? Morgie, they didn't actually kidnap her. You see, what? I guess I was trying to take it in. What do you mean? Know what she said? Sarah, he choked for a second, then continued. She said, yes, I want to go back. Chapter 14. Before I could ask him what the hell he was talking about, the medics were ringing the doorbell. They strode in with a gurney, also rolling a portable plasma Roman 4, young guys who looked like they'd be more at home at a garden hockey game, followed immediately by 2 uniformed policemen, actually policewomen, one short and heavy, with reddish hair, the other a wiry young Hispanic. I found out that ambulances called out for stabbing or gunshot wounds automatically get a cop escort. In less than 3 minutes, Lou was in the blue and white ambulance and on his way to St. Vincent's emergency room. I rode in the back seat of the squad car as we followed them and tried to explain what little I knew of what had happened. It turned out to be an education in the mindless sticking points of the law. Long story short, the fact that I hadn't reported the burglary of my apartment that very same day immediately cast out on my seriousness as a truth-seeking citizen. I had no proof the unreported burglary of my apartment, if indeed such had actually occurred, was by some Guatemalan military attaché named José Alvino Ramos. Since Lou had never seen Colonel Ramos before tonight, he couldn't possibly identify him as that burglar either. Accusing diplomats of a crime without ironclad proof was frowned on downtown, and when I stupidly repeated what Lou had said about Sarah's last words, well, he was going to tell them sooner or later. It would just come bubbling out at some point. The whole case that she was kidnapped went into revision mode. By the time we got to the hospital, I was getting questions that seemed to imply that maybe it was all a domestic affair like most of their calls. Some spaced-out chick who'd run away once and got brought back, and then, still unstable and crazy, decided to knife her own dad and appear again. Now he was understandably covering for her. Happened more than you'd think. I kept stressing that Lou was former FBI and not the sort to invent such a whopper, but this was listened to in skeptical silence. If it was a kidnapping, they then wondered aloud what was the motive, and where were the demands of the perpetrators. I was ready to start yelling at them by the time we parked in the 7th Avenue driveway of the emergency room at St. Vincent's. They next made me cool my heels in the waiting room while they went back to interrogate Lou. They were with him for almost an hour, then came back to where I was and asked me to read and sign the report they'd written. A troubled girl who had emerged from a coma and apparently was suffering bouts of non-rationality had disappeared, and her father had been stabbed, but not seriously. He was the only witness to the incident and claimed she'd been kidnapped. However, the girl had run away once, grievously, and there was no physical evidence she'd been taken against her will. In fact, her father admitted she had declared just the opposite. The whole incident would be investigated further after he came downtown and made a complete statement. I'm not going to sign this. I handed it back, fuming. Is there anything here that's not factually correct? The Hispanic cop was looking me straight in the eye, her expression cold as Alaska. The question made me seethe. Era was probably already on her way out of the country, and here I was trying to reason with two women who practically thought she was the criminal. But I knew a lost cause when I saw one. Forget about it. I want to see Lou. An intern was coming out, and I snagged him, announced I was next of kin to a patient, and demanded to be taken through the official door and into the back. At that moment, the stout cop's radio crackled. They were being summoned to a Christopher Street gay bar where somebody had just been knifed in a back room. She looked at me as though to say, "This sounds like a real crime," and then they hurried out for their squad car. Christ, the intern, a young black guy, led me past a row of gurneys and into a private room at the rear of the huge space. Lou was bandaged all around his chest and hooked up to an Roman 4 and a monitor. He looked better, but I wasn't sure he'd be ready for what I was about to tell him. Hey, how are you feeling? I asked as I walked in, trying to seem upbeat. Fucking cops. He was boiling, his face actually red. Where do they get them these days? McDonald's rejects? Easy, don't get your blood pressure up. I reached over and touched his brow. It felt like he had a mild temperature. Let's all just calm down and try to think rationally. Yeah, I'm thinking rationally. You saw that fax I got from Williams. You think that was Alex Goddard, see? It had next to her, right? Who else? When she was in her moonbeam phase, she must have heard about him and gone up there and ended up in his clutches. But why did she let him take her down to? He told me he has a clinic in Centra America. He called it a place of miracles. And then Colonel Ramos shows up, part of the Guatemalan diplomatic corps. Put 2 and 2 together. That's got to be where they're taking her. Who knows, but I'm going to get the boys downtown. And to put out a missing persons APB nationwide. Jerry'll do it for me if I ask. Fuck New York's finest. They ain't gonna do crap anyway. I listened, wondering how to impress my bright idea upon him. The chances were raw. Mose was taking Sarah back to Guatemala. Probably right this minute, for some kind of unfinished business, or just to hold her there as an insurance policy that Children of Light would never be mentioned in my picture. I seriously doubt a missing persons alert is going to do any good, Lou, because I seriously doubt she's going to be walking the streets of this country. That bastard Ramos is taking her where he knows he can hide her. You mean Jesus? He stared at me as though the idea had never crossed his mind. I think he just repressed it. What are we going to? The only thing we can do. I'm going down there. I'm going to go straight down there and locate Alex Goddard. That's an exceptionally lousy thought process. His voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. Why? Give me one good reason why. You think the police down there are going to bring charges against a colonel? I really could have used some encouragement. It's the only way, Morgan. You've always been high-strung. He sighed and then winced. Ever since you were a kid. I worried about you then, and I'm worried about you now. I don't want you to go down there and get into trouble. Because, believe me, that's a seriously wrong place to get crossways with the pricks who make the rules. You don't know your way around that third world crap hole. Wouldn't be that hard to end up a statistic. We can alert the embassy. Have them start looking for her. Listen, there's a lot more going on between Alex Goddard and me than you know. This was definitely not the time to tell him about the babies or about Carly and the threats. Trust me, I'm going down there. In the morning, if I can. Who knows, Sarah and Ramos might even be on the same plane. As I was finishing that pronouncement, 2 nurses came in rolling a gurney and announced that his room was ready. Then they gave him a sedative. Was I being irrational? The thing. As though, what would you do? I was absolutely sure Ramos had taken her, so it was obvious that was where he would go next. He was a diplomat, apparently, so he could easily fudge the passport formalities, as the nurses were helping. Onto the gurney, I stood there holding his hand and thinking about what lay ahead. Steve was in Belize and maybe not even reachable, but I decided to start by giving him a call the minute I got home. Then a middle-aged wass, with dark hair, slightly balding, strode in the room. The photo ID on his chest read Dr. M. Summers. So, how's the patient? He inquired cheerily, ignoring me as he immediately began checking the chart at the foot of Lou. Bed felt better, Lou said, not being taken in by his pro forma cheer. Well, we're going to make sure you get a good night's rest. Dr. Summers finished with the chart and started taking his pulse. What's left of it? How long am I going to be in here, Doc? Lou asked, flinching as the nurses removed the Roman 4 stuck in his arm. A couple of days. For observation, to make sure there are no complications. He smiled again. You're a lucky man, Mr. Crenshaw. Just a superficial cut, but we don't want you out playing handball for a few days. He turned and gave me a conspiratorial wink, then glanced back. Okay, up we go. Can I come with him? I asked, not optimistic, but hoping. The doctor looked genuinely contrite. I'm really sorry, but he's going to be fine and visiting hours are long past. You can call in the morning, and you can come up anytime after 2 p.m. tomorrow. Let's let him get some rest now. I walked around and took Lou's hand, hot and fevered, feeling so agitated. Don't think about anything tonight, okay? Worrying won't help, just get some sleep. I'm going to find her, I promise you. Don't he mumble. Well, some words, but I think the sedative the nurses had given him was seriously starting to kick. Look, you can call down to 26 Federal Plaza tomorrow. See what they can do. In the meantime, let me follow my nose. He tried to answer, but he was too far gone. I then watched wistfully as he disappeared down the sterile alley of beds. After I stopped by the desk and helped them fill out the insurance forms, I caught a cab downtown to retrieve my Toyota. A time was now 2:15 in the morning, but I still had plenty to do. When I got home, the first thing I did after I walked in the door was grab a phone book and call American Airlines. They had a flight in the morning at 9:30. I gave them my credit card specifics and made a reservation. No longer thought that Alex Goddard's Children of Light and its Guatemalan accomplices were merely doing something shady. My hunch now was that it was completely illegal. They were getting hundreds of white babies in some way that couldn't bear the light of day, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to prevent me from highlighting them in my film. And with the army involved, and now Sarah taken, their aim was beginning to feel more and more like kidnapping. They certainly knew how Sarah had become a pawn, and all because of me. I almost wondered if I'd been unconsciously led to him by her, though that was impossible, whatever had happened. A remorse I now felt was overpowering. It was, in fact, an intensified version of the guilt that had dogged me for the past 15 years, the horrible feeling I'd somehow let her down, not done enough for her. I could have flown back for her high school graduation, but I was cramming for grad school finals and didn't take the time. Things like that, which, looking back, seemed terribly selfish, and now I'd brought this on her. God, okay, I thought, glancing at the clock, I'm to start making it up to her. Screw up your courage and wake Steve. The problem was, Lou had been right about one thing. It had been years since I'd been to Guatemala, and I wasn't sure I knew beans about how things operated down there these days. I was high on motivation, and only so-so in the area of modus operandi. I needed Steve's help in plying the tricky waters of that part of the planet. He was busy, but this was definitely us against the world. Time, so maybe he could drive over to Guatemala City and help. I picked up the phone again and punched in the number of his hotel in Belize City, which seemed to be embedded permanently in my brain. That wonderful accent at the desk. On and then they were ringing his room. I had no reason on earth to assume he would be there, but the click, the voice, it was him. Sorry to call so late, love. You said you missed me, so I've decided to find out if it's true. Your coming attraction is about to arrive. I guess I was trying to keep it flip. After our talk that morning, I wasn't entirely sure where we stood anymore. Who Morgie, is that you? God, it's two, are you okay? Then he started coming around. And processing what I said. You're coming, honey, that's great. As I noted before, he always knew how to give a good reading, sound sincere, no matter what the occasion. Actually, I've just made a plane reservation, and I'm going to be in Guatemala City tomorrow, just after noon. I hesitated, then thought, why beat around the bush? Care to meet me there? That's terrific, he declared, coming fully awake. But why don't you just come to Belize City? Can't you get flight? It's actually not nearly as wild here as the travel books. Well, I'd rather not talk about this on the phone, but do you think you could get free and drive over? I really could use your help. I've got a situation. Well, he paused. I could be there by late tomorrow, assuming my rented Jeep still operates after last week and the roads haven't totally disintegrated. Where are you going to be staying? I don't know. Got any suggestions? I want to keep out of the limelight. Then try the Camino Reel. It's like a Holiday Inn with plastic palm trees, definitely low maintenance and low profile. Hang on, I'll get you the number, which he did, though I could hear him stumbling around. The room in the dark. Then he continued. But listen, here's the bad news. I've got to be back here day after tomorrow. I just got a special permit to do some night shooting in the Jaguar Preserve down by Victoria Peak. You remember the rainforest I told you about? But it's only good for one night, and I hear rumors there's an off-season hurricane forming in the Caribbean, which means I've got to stick to schedule. After that, though, I'm free again. We'll work it out. But I was thrilled he would just drop everything and come. Maybe we were over the rough spot about the baby. He didn't bring that up, and I didn't either. Instead, we killed a few minutes, and then I let him go back to sleep. I wanted to say I love you, but I didn't want to push my luck. After that, I called the hotel he'd recommended. The exchange was more Spanish than English, but they had a room. Apparently lots of rooms. Next, I rang Paula Marks, even though he was terribly late. She must have had the phones off, but I left a message telling her to be careful, with a postscript that I'd explain everything later. Just stick close to home. Finally, I called David's voicemail up at Applecore. I told him I had a personal crisis and was going to Guatemala City. I'd try to be back by the end of the week, hell or high water, but no guarantees. And if he touched so much as a frame of my work print while I was gone, I'd personally strangle him. I don't remember much of what happened next. I basically went on autopilot. It's as though I dropped into a trance, totally focused. I packed my passport, a good business suit, the tailored blue one, and also a set of mix and match separates, easy to roll and cram in. Finally, a couple of pairs of good clean jeans, a few toiletries, and then, thinking ahead, I also threw in my yellow plastic flashlight. I almost always overpack. But not this time. Oh, and one other thing. For airplane reading, I grabbed a Lonely Planet guide to Central America that Steve had left behind. I guess he figured he was at the stage of life to start writing them, not reading them. That turned out to be very helpful, particularly the map of Guatemala City and the northern Piton rainforest. I then collapsed, and images of Sarah's emaciated face haunting my consciousness caught a couple of hours' sleep. The next thing, he knew it was 9:20 a.m., and I was settling into window seat 29F on American Airlines Flight 377, next to a 200-pound executive busy ripping articles out of the business section of El Diario, headed for Guatemala City. Chapter 15. For once in my life, I took my time getting off an airplane. But the instant I felt that first burst of humid tropical air against my face, like a gush from a sauna, I found myself wondering what Sarah had felt. the moment her feet first touched the ground of Guatemala. In fact, I decided to try to think like her to better understand why she might want to come back. Truthfully, I didn't have a clue, but first things first. Not knowing whether I was being stalked by Ramos or his proxies, I decided the idea was to see and not be seen, which actually was easier than I'd expected, at least during the initial pell-mell stages. Turned out the self-centeredness of home. A sapiens blossoms under those circumstances. Ignore thy neighbor, goes the credo. I just buried myself in the crush when I got to immigration. I labored through the formalities, as all countries love to call the suspicious looks from their airport bureaucrats, along with all the other gringo passengers on AA Flight 377, paranoid I might be arrested on the spot for some spurious reason. The purpose of my visit, I declared, was tourism. Just a nod at my passport and a stamp, which looked exactly like the one in Sarah's. I stared at it and felt a renewed sense of purpose. In fact, the photo in my passport looked more than a little like her. Maybe, I thought, I'm getting carried away with the identity issue, but there it was. As I emerged through the wide glass doors of the arrival area, which fronted out onto the steps leading down to the parking lots and the humidity, I spotted a black Land Rover with tinted windows right in front. Oh, that was, Steve once told me, a vehicle much favored by the notorious Guatemalan G2 military secret police, who had retired the cup for murderous human rights abuses of the past 2 decades. Then 2 middle-aged men with Latin mustaches and nondescript brown shirts began getting out through the door on the far side. They next walked around to the terminal side of the car and glanced up the steps in my direction, as though looking for somebody. It was a quick survey, after which they turned back and nodded to the vehicle before it sped away. What's that about? Am I imagining things already? By the time I reached the bottom of the steps, I was being besieged by clamoring cabbies, so it was difficult to keep an eye on the 2 men who were now walking off to the side of the main commotion, toward a shady grove of palms at the end of the arrival drive, lighting cigarettes. Get out of here. Whether you're fantasizing or not, the thing to do is grab an unsuspecting cab and get going. I strolled toward the other end of the long row of concrete steps till I reached an area where cabs were parked, more drivers lurking in wait. They all looked the same way most cabbies in third world lands look, shabby clothes, with beat-up cars, an expression in their eyes somewhere between aggression and desperation. Just pick one whose car looks like it might actually make it to downtown. I spotted a dark blue Chevy that seemed clean and well-maintained, its driver young and full of male hormones as he beckoned me to his vehicle, all the while undressing me with his eyes. Yep, he was definitely my guy. I ambled by his car, acting as though I was ignoring the innuendos of his pitch. Then I bolted for the back door, opened it myself since he was too startled to help, threw in my carry-ons, piled in behind them, and yelled, "Let's go." Rapido. As we sped away, I realized his greatest surprise was that I hadn't raised the subject of price. At that point, it was the last thing on my mind. I looked back to see the 2 guys from the black Land Rover, together with 2 others, heading for a car that had been double-parked right in front. Had I been right after all? We made a high-speed turn onto the highway, and I immediately ordered the driver to take a service road that led off toward a cluster of gas stations and parking lots with falling down barbed wire fences. I figured I had about half a minute of lead time, whatever was going on. We dodged massive potholes and the loose gravel flew, but then we reached a ramshackle gas station, and I ordered him to pull in. Then I watched the line of traffic speeding by on the main highway for several minutes. Nobody pulled off. Good. My driver finally got around to asking where I wanted to go, and as calmly as I could, I told him, the Palacio Nacional. See. With that, he gunned his engine and spun out, Jesus, más despacio, por favor. Okay, he said, showing off his English as he donned his sunglasses. I go more slow, no problem. The initial destination was part of my new plan, hatched while I was on the plane. When I was reading my guidebook and filling out my entry card, I'd had a bright idea. I knew exactly how I wanted to begin, heading into town, the time now the midday. Love the afternoon. I leaned back in the seat and tried to absorb the view to get a feeling for where I was. We first traveled through the suburban fringes, the heavily guarded luxurious mansions of the landholding and military elite, the 1% of Guatemala who own 99% of the country. Iron fences and wide expanses of lawn, protected by Uzi-toting security, guarded whimsical architectural conceits topped by silver satellite dishes. A 20-foot wall shielded their delicate eyes from the city's largest shantytown, makeshift hovels of bamboo and rusted tin, with no signs of water or drains or toilets. Guatemala City. As Steve had put it once, a million doomed cities. The rich and the poor, trapped together side by side in the most modern capital in Central America. Why on earth had Sarah decided to come here? Even if she did travel with the mesmerizing Alex Goddard, it was hard to imagine a place less spiritual. Couldn't she feel that this was all wrong? One of us had to be missing something major. 15 minutes later, I was passing through the fetid atmosphere of downtown, which seemed to be another world, Guatemala City's twin. Seoul. It was an urban hodgepodge of Burger King, McDonald's, discount electronics emporia, an eye-numbing profusion of plastic signs, filthy parking lots, rattle-trap buses and taxis, stalled traffic. Exhaust fumes thickened the air. And everywhere you looked, teenage guards in uniforms loitered in front of stores and banks with sawed-off shotguns. Boys so green and scared-looking you'd think twice about letting one of them park your car. But there they were, weapons. At the ready, nervously monitoring passers-by. Who were they defending all the wealth from? The ragged street children with swollen bellies and skin disease, vending single cigarettes from open packs. Or the hordes of widows and orphans, beneficiaries of the Army's Mayan pacification program, who now begged for centavos or plaintively hawked half-rotten fruit from the safety of the shadows? My bright idea destination was a government office in the Palacio Nacional, right in this center of town, where I hoped I could find Sarah's old landing card, the record of when tourists arrived and departed. When I'd filled mine out on the plane, I'd realized you were supposed to put down where you'd be staying in Guatemala. I figured the best way to locate her this time was to find out where she went last time. As my cab pulled up in front, a black Land Rover was parked in a prohibido estacionarse zone by the front steps. To my eyes it looked like the same one I'd seen at the airport. Shit. But nobody was around, so I decided maybe I was just being paranoid again. The Palacio turned out to be a mixture of Moorish and faux Greek architecture, with a facade of light green imitation stone that gave off the impression of a large Rococo wedding cake. I took a long look, paid off the driver who had turned out to be very nice and headed in. It was, after all, a public building, open to tourist gringos. Nobody in the lobby appeared to take any particular notice of me, so after going through their very serious security, uniforms and guns everywhere, I checked the directory. It turned out the president, cabinet ministers, and high military officers all kept offices there, but it didn't take long to find the bureau I was looking for. Going down the marble-floored hallway on the 3rd floor, I passed by the sala de reception, a vast wood-paneled room of enormous chandeliers, stained-glass windows, and a massive coat of arms. Quite a place, but not my destination. At the far end of the hallway, I found the door I wanted, went in, and tried out the Spanish question I'd been practicing in the cab. Not necessary. English worked fine. Senora, the records for that time were only kept on paper, a Ladino woman declared, shrugging, her nails colored a brash mauve, her hair a burst of red. But you are welcome to look. She'd been on the phone chatting in rapid-fire Spanish, but she quickly hung up and got out her glasses. Thanks. The welcome mat was obviously a little thin. The woman was trying to be friendly, but very quickly her nervousness began to come through. We're always Lad to accommodate Americans searching for friends or relatives, she went on, attempting a smile. Some of your American press has been printing distortions that the Guatemalan army conspired with the CIA to cover up murders. It's a total lie. Right. Maybe you ought to see some of the photos Steve has of the army pacified Maya villages up in the mountains. The search took an hour and a half of leafing through dusty boxes, which chafed my hands raw, but then voila. Ere it was, the crucial piece of information Lou had missed, a hastily scribbled-in landing card for an American with the name Sarah Crenshaw. I stared at it a moment, feeling a glow of success. Was it an omen? It was definitely her. She'd then dotted an I with a smiley face, one of her personal trademarks. Then I looked down the form. What I wanted was the address she'd put down as a destination in Guatemala. The answer: Nino's Del Mundo, Peton Department. Oops, sank. Great. That was like saying your address is Children of the World, lost somewhere in the state of Montana. The home address was equally vague, just New York. So much for the high level of curiosity at immigration. However, a carbon copy of the landing card, which you're supposed to surrender when you leave, was not stapled to it, the way it was on all the others in the box. Naturally, since she'd left in a medevac plane half dead. What does this mean? I got up and walked over to the woman's desk carrying the card. Mainly, I just wanted to get a rise out of her. The carbon copy is missing. Does that mean she could still be here? Red alert. She glanced at the arrival date a moment and her eyes froze. Then, doubtless with visions of another CIA scandal looming in her consciousness, she brusquely announced that the office was getting ready to close for the day. You'll have to pursue any further inquiries through the American Embassy, Mrs. J., which handles all matters concerning U.S. nationals. Well, thanks for all your help. I was finally getting the police state runaround I'd expected all along. I guess I needed her to care, and it was obvious she didn't. Okay, I'd planned to go to the embassy anyway. Maybe they could tell me about this place she'd put on her landing card. Could it be the local name for Alex Goddard's clinic? As I picked up my things, I thought again about the prospect of showing my face on the streets of Guatemala City. Would there be more loitering men in grungy brown shirts waiting to watch my every move? More Black Land Rovers? As I marched back out through the ornate lobby, I decided not to let my imagination get too active. It was now late afternoon, but I was making progress. I also was thinking about Steve, wondering if he'd gotten into town yet. Probably not for another couple of hours, but just thinking about seeing him again and having him for support was boosting my energy. A short cab ride later, I arrived at the embassy of the all-powerful United States of America, a 2-block-long concrete fortress on Reforma Avenue guarded by Yank Marines with heavy automatic weapons. When I explained myself to the PR people manning the reception desk, including my brush with Guatemalan bureaucracy, they told me to check with the internal security section. In fact, if you are looking for an American national, this is where you should have come in the first place, said a very efficient-appearing young woman with a business suit and dark, close-cropped hair. A phone call from here works wonders at the Palacio Nacional. I have no proof Sarah was in Guatemala yet, and if she was, it would doubtless be under a different name. What's more, telling them my suspicion that she'd been kidnapped by a high official and brought here would definitely brand me as a conspiracy. So for now, all I could really hope to get from them was an address for Alex Goddard's clinic, someplace to start. Where and what was Nino's Del Mundo? Apparently, the woman hadn't fully understood that. Moments later, a third male attaché showed up, looking very harried. He also could have been president of the local Young Republicans with a cute haircut and preppy tie, nodded perfectly. Hi, I'm Mel Alberg. How can I told him I wanted to cease. One who was responsible for the records of missing American tourists. I also sensed he was edgy and trying to get it over with fast. All the while he kept checking his watch, only half listening. Gee, I really wish you'd come earlier. He said, Monday afternoons are a little nuts around here, weekly reports due and all, and it's getting late. When he glanced at his watch again, making sure I noticed, I found myself wanting to yell at the guy. I mean, it's been 2 years since this woman you're looking for filled out a landing card. We might have something in the files, but would it be possible for you to come back tomorrow? No, it will not be possible, I lied. I've got a plane back to New York tomorrow. I felt my frustration rising. I wanted to just grab him and shake him. My first thought was to tell him I make documentary films, and maybe he'd like to end up in one about how my country's Guatemala. City Embassy didn't care about its citizens. But then I decided to go in a different, probably more productive direction. Just for 5 minutes, I declared, reaching for feigned helplessness. Well, let me call upstairs, he muttered. Realizing, I suppose, that the best way to get rid of me was to kick me up the chain of command and see if Mr. Morton can take a moment to meet with you. It worked. The next thing I knew, I was in the office of a good-looking dip. Lamat named Barry Morton Gray Temples, tailored suit, rugged face of a 60-year-old soap opera heartthrob who plays tennis and keeps a mistress, chief information officer. Actually, I do remember her vaguely, Morton declared, flashing me his professional smile. The Crenshaw girl was an unfortunate case. To begin with, anybody who overstays their visa that long gets us in a lot of hot water with the locals. They always tend to blame us, Miss James. My name's Morgan James, Miss James. Another of those smiles. Frankly, I don't know what to tell you, though. He shrugged, exuding helplessness. It's hard to keep track of every American tourist who comes and goes through this country. Some of the hippie types end up in a mountain village somewhere, gone native. In this instance, as I recall, we got her out on a medevac. Her landing card gave her destination as someplace called Nino's Del Mundo, up to the Peton. That ring a bell? Any idea how I could find it? Nino's Del Mundo. He glanced up quickly. That's a new one on me. He'd been fiddling with a stack of papers on his desk, giving me only half his attention, but he abruptly stopped. You try the phone book. Like I said, it's in the Peton. I was getting the definite sense he wanted to get rid of me as soon as possible. The whole scene was feeling tense and off. My understanding is that's mostly rainforest. Do even have phones up there? Not many, he said, his tone starting to definitely acquire an I have better things to do edge. That was when he focused in on me, his look turning protective. Let me speak candidly, Miss James Stree. Clear off the record. Down here people have been known to disappear just for asking too many questions. Curiosity killed the cat and all that. Between us, this place is still a police state in many regards. You want my advice? Let leaping dogs lie. Just forget about this Crenshaw girl. She's out of the country now, so let me put it like this. People who go poking around here are just asking for trouble. I felt a ring of sincerity in his voice, maybe a little too much sincerity. Why was he so worried for me? That may be true, but I'm still going to see what I can find out. My heart is pure. Why should anybody care? Do what you think best, he said with a sigh, but I've told you everything we know, which I'm afraid is actually very little. By the way, try one more thing on him, I thought, see what he'll say. Since you're so concerned about Sarah, you'll be relieved to know she's regained consciousness and started to talk. There seemed no point in telling him any more. The rest was all still speculation. That stopped him cold. What has she said? His eyes appeared startled in the glaring light of the office fluorescence. At long last I had his undivided attention. You're busy, I smiled at him. I don't want to bore you with details, but it's just going to be a matter of time before she remembers exactly what happened down here. She hasn't talked about it yet? He was fiddling with an ornate letter opener, an onyx jaguar head on the handle. She's getting there. I stared back at him, trying to read his mood. We may soon find out who was behind whatever happened to her. Then I tried a long shot. Maybe officialdom here had something to do with it. Let me tell you something. He sighed again, seeming to regain his composure. The sovereign state of Guatemala definitely plays by its own rules, whenever foreigners down here meet with. Foul play, lower-level officials have developed a consensus over the years that sometimes it's better not be too industrious. Nobody's ever sure of what, or who, they might turn up. The meeting was definitely ending, and once again I had more questions than answers. Something about Barry Morton felt wrong, but I couldn't quite get a grip on what it was. One thing I was certain of, he knew more than he was telling me. Why was that, as I was exiting through his outer office, heading for the swarming streets below? I waved goodbye to his secretary, a stout, 50-ish Ladino matron with defiantly black-dyed hair. A hard look mitigated somewhat by the zircon trim on her thick glasses, and a small silver pendant nestled on her ample, low-cut sweater. It was the pendant that caught my eye, being the silver face of a cat, most likely the local jaguar. Looked just like the ones I'd seen you know where. I was staring so hard I almost stumbled. Over a chair. Yes, it was definitely like those I remembered from Kevin and Rachel. The only difference was when she bent over to reach for her stapler, the medallion twisted around and the back, I could see, flashed blank silver, no in gray. Bing of lines and dots, so where did she get it? I started to ask her, but decided I'd just get more BS runaround. Then I had another thought. Maybe she handled a lot of things that never made it to Barry Morton's desk. The "don't waste the boss's valuable time" kind of secretary. Maybe she's the one I really should have been talking to, the kind of woman who takes care of everything while the high-paid senior supervisor is at long lunches. She looked at me, and our eyes met and held for a second. Had she been listening in on my chat with Morton? Did she know something I ought to know? By then, however, thoughts of Steve were weighing in. I hadn't seen him in 3.5 months, and I was realizing that was about my limit. I wanted to recapture the lost time. Our being together was going to make everything turn out right. Clinging to that thought, I grabbed a cab and headed for my hotel and a much-overdue hot bath. Chapter 16. "Come here," he said. Whoosh. There he was. He strode through the door, tan safari shirt, smelling like a man who'd just driven hundreds of miles through Central America in an open Jeep. I wanted to undress him with my teeth and lick off the sweat. Brown eyes, skin tan as leather, he threw his arms around me, and I felt the weight of the world slip away. He was here. I was wearing a robe, fresh from the tub, but it was gone in a second. Steve, I gotta say. He knew a thing or two about the bedroom. As we wound ourselves together for the next 2 hours, I had a refresher course in how much I missed him, soul and body. His taste, his skin, his touch. Finally, we were both so exhausted I just lay there bathed in sweat, spooned together on the sagging bed. I hadn't felt so good in years. It was like another world. "God, I've missed you," I said again, holding him closer. The air conditioning was beginning to lose ground against the late sun, but I didn't care. After my solo nightmare of the last 2 days, I was remembering what it was like to be a couple again. The Camino Real, by the way, turned out to be an American-style hideaway with budget shag carpeting and flaking blue walls. In a way, though, the downtrodden decor actually made it more romantic, like we'd sneaked off to a garish hot-sheet motel for a twilight rendezvous. I finally dragged myself up and got us a bottle of water. Then, leaning against the rickety headboard, I recounted an abbreviated version of what had happened yesterday after we'd first talked the theft of my film, and then Lou being assaulted and Sarah taken, apparently willingly, to be brought. I strongly suspected, back here. What I held out on were the details about a certain Colonel Jose Alvino Ramos, my belief that he was behind the crimes and in league with Alex Goddard and stalking me. I was afraid our room was bugged. "Morgie, we'll get through this," he said, reaching over to stroke my hair. "If somebody brought her back down here, we'll find her, and I apologize for being such a shit on the phone about the baby. I just had a local lose 3 rolls of high-speed Kodachrome, and I was seriously frosted at the world. We can keep trying if you want to. Just hold me." I put down my glass, and I reached around and ran my finger across his chest. It was, oh, lovely to be this close to somebody you wanted so much. I loved his earnest brown eyes and his soft skin. I loved him. Just having him with me made such a difference. The unexpected part was, I'd asked him to come and help me. But now that he was here, I was starting to feel uneasy about luring him into my personal nightmare. Was that really fair? Also, I was getting hints he had problems of his own. The photo book, I gathered, was not coming together. A way he'd hoped. He'd mumbled something about finding himself torn between a heartstrings essay about the children, his specialty. You've probably seen his work, whether you know it or not. A devastating portrayal of the latest craw. Of sleazy politicos, or a nature valentine to the vanishing rainforest. But whenever he agonized about his work, I knew enough to keep my mouth shut and just listen. He didn't want bright ideas. He just wanted me to am up and be there for him. Anyway, I knew he'd think his way through the problem. He had a deceptive air of vulnerability that always disappeared in a crunch. He was the master of ad hoc solutions. At that moment, he reached for his Och studied it and abruptly bolted straight up. Hey, I almost forgot my surprise. I hope you're still up for it. Did you know this is our anniversary? It was on this very day I first watched you dive into that grungy swimming pool at the Olofsson in Port-au-Prince. My God, you're right. I'm humiliated. I hugged him contritely, feeling like a self-centered twit. I guess I was too focused on Sarah. I screw up a lot on birthdays too, always with an X. Q's. I don't even have a present for you. I've been so. That's okay. He grinned, then stood up and headed for the shower. Not the first time, but I've got one for both of us. We'll make it a gift to each other. It'll help start. You thinking like a Guatemalteco insider. What, you sneak? What did you get? A trip back into the void of prehistoric time, he yelled over his shoulder. I am the possessor of a little-known secret about this town. I called from Bell City this morning and made dinner reservations for us downtown. You'll see. God, I loved this man. But the last thing on my mind at that moment was food. Honey, I don't know if I'm really... Hey, don't wimp out on me. If we're going to do this place, at least we can do it in style. Besides, you can't live on smog alone. You gotta eat. He had a point. Starving myself wasn't going to help find Sarah any sooner, and there were details I wanted to tell him that I didn't want to broadcast in the room. What if Colonel Ramos had long ears to match his long arm? Come on, he pressed. Just put on the slinkiest thing you've got and get ready to go native. It'll help you put this part of the world into perspective. Alas, I had nothing particularly slinky, though fortunately I'd packed a silk blouse I could loosen and tie with a scarf around the waist. Don't laugh, it worked. I even brushed on some serious eyeshadow, which normally I don't bother with much. I tried not to let him know how concerned I was as we walked down the driveway of the hotel and hailed a cab, while I furtively searched the shadows. Seeing the streets after dark made me sad all over again for Sarah. I still wanted to see and feel Guatemala the way she had, but when I got close to the realities of the place, it made me uneasy. It turned out the marvel he'd discovered was called Siriacos, a wonderful old place with a patio and garden in back, both roofed by glittering tropical stars which were down a stone pathway from the main dining room and bar. It appeared to be where a lot of VIPs, the ruling oligarchy, dined. It was romantic and perfect. When we arrived, his special anniversary surprise was already being laid out on a low stone table, attended by Mayan women all in traditional dress. The colorful huipil blouses of their villages, red and blue skirts, immense jade earrings. They've reconstructed a kingly feast from old documents, he explained, beaming at my amazement. Cuisine of the ancient rainforest. We're going to have a banquet of authentic Guatemalteco chow from eons ago, and the meal was definitely fit for royalty. Soon we were working our way through a long-forgotten medley of piquant flavors that swept through my senses as though I were in another world. There was pit-roasted deer, steamed fish, baked iled turkey. One calabash bowl set forth coriander-flavored kidney beans. Another had half a dozen varieties of green legumes, all in a rich turtle broth. A third offered vanilla-seasoned sweet potatoes. Others had various forest tube, or steamed with chilies. We even had a delicious honey wine like heavenly nectar, served in red clay bowls that made me want to have sex right on the table. There with Steve, the unexpected juxtaposition of spices and flavors made. Every bite, every aroma, a new sensual experience. Let me say right here he's a cooking fanatic, whereas I've been known to burn water. I think it's the new division of labor in post-feminist America. Finally, the Mayan waitresses brought out cups of a chocolate dessert drink from ancient times, cocoa beans roasted, ground, and boiled with sugarcane. The whole event was pure heaven, except for the occasional unwanted intrusions. Various dark-eyed low-cut Ladino divorcees, about half a dozen in all, hanging out at the bar with heavy perfume and too much jewelry, kept coming over purportedly to marvel over our private feast, or was it Steve's big brown eyes? He returned their attentions with his polite and perfect Spanish, but I despised them. In any case, they were shameless. Not remembering quite enough Espanol, however, the best I could do was just to put my hand on his and give them the evil eye. It seemed to work. Though what I really wanted to do was hold up a cross the way you do to ward off vampires. "Hey, check out Orion," he said, finally leaning back, an easy, delicious finger aimed at that sprawling constellation. I looked up at the canna of stars, and sure enough, the hunter and his sword dominated the starry sky above like a stalwart centurion guarding us. I always know I'm in the tropics when it's right overhead. "Honey, this has been wonderful," I declared. "Thank you so much." I moved around and kissed him. It's exactly the attitude adjustment I needed. Well, he smiled back. "Now, I guess we've got some organizing to do, so tell me everything you left out back there at the hotel." "I know you were holding off." I was feeling increasingly hyper, probably from the high-octane chocolate, but I proceeded to recount all my findings about Alex Goddard and Quetzal Manor. Then I moved on to Colonel Ramos and how he threatened Carly and me about my film. Finally, I told him my deep belief that Colonel Ramos and a couple of his goons were obviously the ones who'd roughed up Lou and taken Sarah. "Bad scene," he said when I finally paused for breath. He was toying with his cup and running his fingers through his sandy hair in that deep thought mode of his. "Way I see it, this just sounds like a classic case of selling kids. To me, that's right up there with murder and grand larceny. Well, I also firmly believe it's all tied in with Alex Goddard's clinic here, or whatever it is. The place Sarah called Nino's Del Mundo on her landing card. I'll bet you anything that's where Ramos has taken her. You know," he said, his brow a perfect furrow, eyes narrowed. "About the babies you saw, there have been press stories over the last few years about Americans being attacked in Guatemala on suspicion of trying to kidnap my children out in the village. To put up for adoption, but I've never seen any proof of it. I've always thought it just might have been dumb gringos who don't know the culture. They go poking around out in the countryside and stupidly say the wrong thing. Maybe. Using schoolbook Spanish nobody out there really understands. But now this makes me wonder if, love, those babies I saw up at Quetzal Manor are not kidnapped Indian children, trust me. They're Caucasian as vanilla snow cones." I get your point," he said quickly. "But let me relate the facts of life down here. When you've got some Guatemalan colonel behind something, you'd better think twice about how many rocks you turn over. Funny, but that's exactly what some guy at the embassy named Barry Morton said to me. And you'd better listen. This is the country that turned the word disappear into a new kind of verb. People get disappeared. I actually knew some of them, back in the late 80s. One dark night an army truck rolls into a village, and when the torture and other things are over with, a few Maya are never heard from again." He looked at me. "You saw my pictures of that village in the Huehuetenango department. And Tizalala, where the army mutilated and murdered half the... I know all about that." It was chilling to recall his gruesome photos. But I'm going to track down Alex Goddard's clinic no matter what. That's where they've taken Sarah. I'm sure of it. I just may need some help finding it," he grimaced. "Damn, I've got to head back to Belize by noon tomorrow." Then his look brightened. "But hey, I finish my shoot Wednesday so I can drive back here on Thursday. Then, on Friday maybe we could. Come on, love. I can't just sit around till the end of the week. What am I going to do till then?" The very thought made me itchy. "I need to find out if Nino's Del Mundo, the place Sarah put on." Her original landing card is for real. Her card said it's somewhere in the Peton, the rainforest. If I could find somebody who... Okay, look. He was thinking aloud. How about this? There's a guy here in town who owes me a favor. Big one. He screwed me out of 20 grand in the US. We were going to start a travel magazine, I think I told you about that, but then he took my money and split the country. He ended up down here and went to work for the CIA till they sacked him. After that, he leased a helicopter and started some kind of bullshit tourist hustle. He sure as hell knows what's going on. Name's Alan Duper. The prick. Maybe I could give him a call and we could get together for a late drink. He's got an easy number these days, 4 Mayan. How's he going to help? Trust me, he's our guy. I leaned back and closed my eyes, my imagination drifting. In that brief moment, my mind floated back to yesterday. Afternoon at Lou's loft and Sarah. Her hallucinations still haunted me. What had happened to her in the rainforest? And why would she say she wanted to go back? Then I snapped back. All right, try and ring him if you think he can. And help. Right now, I need all I can get. He got up and worked his way to the phone, past the crowded bar, while I tried to contemplate the night sky. I looked up again, hoping to see Orion, but now a dark cloud had moved in, leaving nothing but deepening blackness. He'd said there was a storm brewing, part of an out-of-season hurricane developing in the Caribbean, so I guessed this was the first harbinger. Tonight's out, but tomorrow's okay. He was striding. Back, crack of dawn, which for him is roughly about noon. We'll have a quick get-together, and then I've got to run. Really. But if this guy doesn't know what's going on down here, nobody does. He's probably laid half those hot tomatillos. It's there at the bar. The man has his sources, if you get my meaning. Then let's go back to the glorious Camino Real. I took his hand. We'll split the check. At the moment, even that seems romantic. I'm still thinking about, don't think. I touched his lips, soft and moist, then kissed him. An impulsive but deeply felt act. We've all had enough thinking for one day. Chapter 17. Alan Duper didn't ring till almost 10:30 the next morning, and I had the feeling even that was a stretch. He then offered to meet us in the Park Concordia, right downtown. As I watched him ambling toward our bench, my first impression was, why'd we bother? The man appeared to be in his early 40s, puffy-eyed and pink-cheeked with discount aviator shades, looking like a glad-handing tourist just down to Central America for a weekend of unchaperoned. Owned bacchanals. The flowered sports shirt, worn outside the belt, gave him the aura of a tout insufficiently attired without a can of Coors in hand. How can this be progress? I'm down here hoping to find Sarah, and I end up in a trash fill. Park meeting some expat operator. Steve had explained that the main benefit of Alan Duper's CIA gig was that he did learn how to fly a helicopter. With that skill, he'd ended up starting a tourist agency in Guatemala. City using an old bell he leased. Mayan pyramids from the air. Mainly, though, he was a self-styled bon vivant who knew people. Steve the Brave. On came Duper's mirthless smile as he approached a jaunty spring entering his step. Alan, any friend of yours has got to be brave. Steve just stared at him. Duper had the kind of empty grin that looked like it had been rehearsed in his high school bathroom mirror. It was thin, kind of forked and dangerous, and this morn, in its plaster quality, undermined any attempts at honesty. Maybe dealing with complaining tourists every day of your life did that to you. You called, I came. He was now shifting from foot to foot. Guess it finally had to happen. What's the phrase? You can run, but you can't hide. Surprise us both and pretend you're happy to see me. Steve looked like he was not entirely prepared for this moment. He used the awkward pause that followed to introduce me. Duper shook hand. It's like he was fearful of germs, then turned back. Jesus, man, I'm still working on the money, honest to God. But do I get a last cigarette before the firing squad? Hey, Alan, ease up. Steve was deadpan. Good to see you again. I mean it. Love that Waikiki shirt, by the way. Never knew you had such progressive taste. This is actually my incognito attire. For secret missions, it's my objective today to look like some cruise ship jerk. He glanced around. Nervously. So how am I doing? I'd say your years of training and undercover work have paid off. I listened, remembering Steve had explained that Alan Duper's career as a CIA information gatherer was hampered by his propensity to drink. Too much tequila and then brag about his occupation, hoping to impress whatever woman he had in his sights at the moment. So bring me up to date. Steve was trying to hide his total contempt. Why'd you get out of the spook biz? Langley couldn't find a new mission for you after the evil empire dissolved? Duper's face turned pensive. Man, you don't get it, do you? Langley's still got plenty on its mind. Nothing has changed. Most people don't realize. The U.S. isn't run by the folks they vote for. There's a permanent government that doesn't appear on Larry King, and I was part of it. The Central Intelligence Agency of the U.S. will go on doing exactly what it's always done, hiding events in third-world toilets like this through whatever means are necessary to protect America's strategic concerns, keeping the world safe for Microsoft and Ronald McDonald. He paused and glanced at me, as though slightly embarrassed. Then he continued, What I'm saying is, all those Beltway turkeys with the briar pipes and gigabyte computers, sitting around wringing their hands, worried the company needs a new mission, never really grasped its old mission. It, Steve said, going along with the SH tick, the applause lines Duper had doubtless used in 1,000 bars. I'm getting slow. What Langley needs nowadays is a new cover story. Couldn't have phrased it better. Duper smiled again, too. Silly. They're actually, Steve said, cutting him off impatiently, all the while gazing up at the gathering dark clouds as though they were a hovering adversary. The truth of the matter is, we called you to discuss a favor. A small helping hand. He seemed to be searching for a sales point. For old time's sake. For old time's sake, Duper appeared to be having trouble with the concept. Yeah, all we want is to hear a little talk of the town. He gazed out over the square, Yuzi. Toting police still strolling by. You know, local information of the kind that doesn't make the papers. Right, I said. For starters, how could a gringa sort of melt into the Peton rainforest, disappear for months and months, and then end up in a coma? I decided to feel him out before going for the bigger questions. People disappear down here all the time, and nobody in their right mind goes around inquiring why. Duper seemed genuinely astonished that anyone would find such a thing unusual. He also was fingering a cigarette pack in his breast pocket, clearly nervous about the quick turn our conversation had taken. Whatever's your problem in Guatemala, just forget about it. Drink some cerveza, take a few snapshots of the picturesque natives, and then move on to a civilized place. This is a land of mystery, lady, and the people who matter like it that way. There are those here who take their privacy very seriously. Just like Alex Goddard's Children of Light, I thought, or Nino's Del Mundo, or whatever it's called. It was chilling to hear Alan Duper backing away so quickly from my question. The guy seemed truly scared under all the luster. I also observed that his eyes were curiously small, out of proportion to his face. I hadn't noticed it at first. Well, I went on, determined to push him. An old landing card for the person I'm looking for, said her destiny. Shin was a place called Nino's Del Mundo, up in the Peton. I assume that's somewhere in the northern rainforest, right? So I guess what I want to know is, does that name stir up any connections? He looked around, then extracted a galloy from a blue pack and lit it with a wooden match, flicking the tip with his fingernail. He inhaled, taking his time. Well, maybe I've heard a little something about a place some people call by that name. He drew again on the cigarette. And the story might include a female American tourista or two, about one a year, actually, who have sort of melted into the forest, never to be seen more. I'm not exactly sure where it is, though, or even if what you hear is true. But who cares? Come on, guys, this is Guatemala, for Christ's sake. Shit happens, get a life. The embassy or the CIA or anybody ever carry out an inquiry? I felt my energy rising. A woman every year or so, I went by Rafor. My avenue yesterday and nobody there seems to have ever heard of any of this. No kidding, he snorted. Whatever happened that place, our caring embassy, ain't gonna do zip, don't faint at the news, and there's no way the company's going to pull their old-time Yankee number, roll in with the beige sunglasses, and yell, okay, you peons, we're here to take names and kick butt. What happened to our national? They've recently acquired a habit of taking local situations at face value, makes for a lot better tables at the Tony supper clubs in town. This guy liked to talk, I realized, but he had no interest in going beyond glib one-liners. I glanced at Steve, and I could tell he was having the same thoughts. Tell you what, Steve said finally, how about this? Tell us whatever you know about how to find this place, and maybe we can adjust the terms on the money you screwed me out of. I might settle for something less on the dollar and let back. Bygones be bygones. Hey man, you'll get your money, I'm good for it. Duper sighed and drew on his gallois. It's just that things are a little tight right now, you know. He paused. Matter of fact, I was hoping you might be able to spare a couple of bills for a week or so. But I guess his voice trailed off. Alan Duper knew something I needed to know, or might know it. Steve had definitely found the right guy in that regard, but he clearly was cautious to the point of paralysis as he kept furtively glancing around. What was he so fearful of, and what could I do to convince him to help me? I stood gazing at the dark sky for a long moment, and then I had an off-the-wall idea, a long shot, the all-or. Nothing take you go for when the sun is dying and the unions are looking at overtime. You do tourist flights, right? I started, still working on the idea. So how about pretending I'm an eco-nut, a lover of the rainforest, you? And tell whoever you're so afraid of that you're taking me up into the wilds to show me jaguars or something. A regular tour. Just cruising around, taking in the sights. Totally innocent. And then, if we accidentally scouted a little, maybe we could find the place. Jesus, you're serious about this, aren't you? Duper nervously crushed out his cigarette, staring at me glassy-eyed. Never been more. He extracted another gallois. Okay, a counteroffer, Miss James, Morgan. James. Right, Miss James. I'm beginning to think you've got no realistic sense of proportion about this part of the world. You fools rush in, right? My point precisely. But if Steve here means what he says, well, maybe there's a little room to negotiate. Maybe I could take you on a quick sightseeing trip. And just for laughs, I could kind of inadvertently stray over the area I think you might find productive, assuming we can locate it. But here are my terms. I do it and Steve Areno and me are square. Consider it a $20,000 cruise. Fine with me. Steve didn't even blink, and I loved him all over again, right on the spot. Though the truth was, I knew he'd never planned on eating a penny of the money again anyway. You think this place is Nino's Del Mundo? I was trying not to get my hopes up too much, but still Duper lit his new cigarette. You didn't hear this from me, okay? You heard it from the embassy or some other damned place, but that's one name for it. Another is Jungle Disneyland. Actually, I think the local name is Balam, the old Maya word for jaguar. But everybody acts like it's a state secret, so all you get our rumors. Well, assuming we find it, then how could I get in? I mean, actually in. I was squinting at him, feeling my body tense. What was it Lou had said about a word he'd heard when they were taking Sarah? It sounded like Babylon. I also thought that was what she'd whispered to me. Could it be the word was actually Balam? The gloomy morning skies abruptly flooded with the brilliant white light of hope. I glanced back at Steve, and our eyes locked for a long Morgie, for Chris' sake, what are you saying? Steve took my hand. Don't you realize this is Guatemala? Don't even think about it. We're just talking now, okay? I squeezed his hand, then looked back at Duper. I was just wondering, once we've found it, could I get a sneak look-see, assuming I wanted to? Well, I'll tell you one thing, Miss Morgan James. Duper was fingering his new cigarette, oblivious to my reaction. Give no serious thought to just driving up. The army'd be all over your butt in the time it takes to cock an AK-47. He glanced up at the sky again, though now a dense bank of dark clouds had swallowed what remained of the sun. A pre-rain gloom was enveloped. In the park, which was starting to empty out, the hawkers and loiterers headed home to wait out the weather. But if we do find it, then as long as we're there, I might be able to drop you off for a quick glance somehow, say, if we diddy. Around twilight time, that is, if that's what you want. But it's 10 minutes tops, and that's my final offer. Frankly, I think you'd be ill-advised in the extreme to do it, but in any case, it's got to be a low-profile enterprise all. Away, we screw this up and we could easily swell the ranks of the disappeared. But you think you could actually locate it? What I hear, the place is on a tributary of the Uzumacinta River, a latrine they call the Rio Tiger. Way up in the northwest. Low-level army types, you meet them in bars from time to time, like to BS about it. I've got a rough idea where it might be, though you don't know whether to believe a bunch of kid recruits after half a dozen beer. Then my mind clicked. The Rio Tiger. Didn't that have something to do with where Lou said Sarah was found? That was definitely where I wanted to go. Morgie, have you lost your senses? Steve had placed his hand on my shoulder. If the Army's involved in something down here, you don't want to know about it. Don't lose sight of the fact those goons knocked off 200,000 villagers since the freedom-loving days of the Jipper, for fear they might be commiz with the CI. Practically flying in the ammo. This whole damned country's just one big mass grave. Yet another unclaimed corpse or two won't make a hell of a lot of difference. Steve, I'll bet you anything that's where she is. Saying it, I had a vision of all the things that had happened to me and to Sarah because of Alex Goddard. I couldn't wait to confront the bastard. He's brought her back. Steve just glared at me for a long moment, despairing. Christ, you make me nuts. Okay, look. How about this? At least let me come with you. That way we'll face the unknown together. Though I had a lump in the throat moment, I didn't say anything, just stood there glorying in the feeling of being together. It was so wonderful to have him with me, and so difficult to think about pressing on without him. There was a long, awkward pause, and then he glanced at his watch. Blast. I've got to hit the road if I'm going to get back in time to set up for tonight's shoot. I can beat the rain. Then he pulled me around and circled me fully in his arms. Please, Morgie, I really don't like the sound of this. I'll move heaven and earth to get back here by Friday night, and if you still want to check out this Balam place, then we'll figure out a way to do it together. Just you stay safe. I hugged him back. Nothing I do is going to mean much if I don't have you. Don't worry, I'll be okay. Alan Duper had abruptly taken an even deeper interest in the darkening sky. I got the feeling he was uncomfortable being around two people capable of caring. It's only for a couple of days, Steve went on. We'll both be okay if we just stick together. Right, I said, and kissed him harder than I ever had. 5 minutes later, my heart and my head still at war with each other. I was alone in the virtually empty park with my brand-new best friend, watching Steve's Jeep blend into a smoggy haze of the avenue made me feel like half of me had just disappeared into another dimension. So that's that, I declared finally, turning back and taking a deep breath. I had to find Sarah before something else truly horrible happened to her, and the one thing I was determined to do was keep Steve as safely distant from my search as I could, even though it meant I was going to be terribly lonely for the next few days. When can we leave? Hey, get real. Ooper choked, whirling around. We can't go today. Case you hadn't noticed, there's a storm coming. If you really want to go, and I mean really want to, then maybe in a day or so, preferably when Steve, I don't want to drag him into this, I said evenly. Truthfully, I was sounding braver than I felt. But then I remembered once going down into the 400-year-old subterranean harem quarters of the Red Fort in Agra, seemingly miles underground and pitch black, with nothing but a flashlight, surrounded by screaming bats and knee-deep in guano, for no better reason than I was determined to see how the women there once lived. So how much scarier could this be? Well, I say no way. Duper told me. Not today. Correction, make that no fucking way. He had removed his aviator shades and was cleaning them with a dirty hanky. Besides, I don't think you have any business going up there in the first place. If you're not scared shitless, you ought to be. Alan, I think you're the one who's afraid to go. He almost reached for another cigarette, but then stopped himself. I will definitely plead guilty to a deep-seated disquiet about the people. Rule this placid paradise. But if it'll square things with Steve, then I'll take you up to have a quick look for my sins. But it's got to be after the weather clears. I finally realized he was already thinking about his next loan. Eve beware. Tomorrow, then? I wasn't going to blink, because the Peaton was where Sarah had ended up the first time, and I was sure that was where Ramos had taken her now. Balaam, Duper stared at the sky a moment longer, then caved. Maybe we can shoot for tomorrow late, if I can convince myself this storm has done its worst. He looked back at me. But I gotta tell you one thing, Miss Morgan James. We blunder in up there and end up getting ourselves disappear. But we won't even get our pictures in the papers. You'd better tell your immediate loved ones where you're going, and it wouldn't be the worst time in the world to think about making a will. The way he said it, I was sure for once he meant every word. Chapter 18. When I got back to the Camino reel, the time was early afternoon, and the bed was freshly made, with all signs and sense of my and Steve's torrid reunion long gone. I tried to push aside thoughts of how much I was already missing him and focus on what I was getting myself into. I must admit, I was having serious qualms about going up to the Peaton, the part of Guatemala where Sarah had been left for dead, with my brand-new tour director, the Lakey Alan Duper. I'd never been in a helicopter before, much less one flying over a stormy rainforest. On the other hand, if that was where they'd taken Sarah, the sooner I got there, the better. Sitting there in the room, I found myself feeling right at home. Everything about it was so familiar to an expert on budget travel like me. Off-brand carpet the color of decaying vegetation. The usual 2 double beds, one totally unused, except as a suitcase shelf. The TV suspended over the dresser and bolted to the wall. Funny, but it was the first time I'd noticed half the things in the room. Okay, I told myself, the thing to do first is call St. Vincent's and check on Lou. Also, I wanted to tell him what was happening. I just hoped he wouldn't launch into a lecture about the recklessness of what I was planning. I needed support, not male advice. I got the desk to give me the local AT&T contact number, then rang right through to St. Vincent's. The next thing I knew, they were calling his room. Hi, how's the patient? Morgan, what the hell are you up to? I've been trying to reach you. I finally called David, and he said you'd left a message. Something about Central America. Why the hell? I was trying to explain that to you Sunday night, but you were pretty far gone. Well, I ain't that far gone now, so I'm telling you to, by the way, I interrupted, hoping to change the subject. How are you feeling? I guess I'll live. They let me get up and go to the bathroom now. They're saying I can probably go home tomorrow. That's encouraging. Thank God he was going to be okay. I also had a talk with Jerry. Downtown? He believes Sarah was kidnapped, even if New York's finest don't, so that means the FBI has jurisdiction. We're gonna get some action. They're trying to get a photo of that colonel, so maybe I can ID the bastard. But the consulate's giving us a lot of shit about it. Well, I'm tracking something down here. Between the two of us, I think we'll find her. So, what the hell are you doing? I told him about finding the name of a destination on Sarah's old landing card, and about meeting a guy who was going to take me there as soon as the weather cleared. And you think she could be there now? He didn't sound hopeful. There are reasons to check it out. I didn't want to elaborate. Maybe. We'll get lucky. I was attempting to say as little as possible, fearing the phone was tapped. In that spirit, I decided to get off the line as quickly as possible. Lou, you get lots of rest, and I'll try and call you tomorrow. With a final warning to watch out for myself, he took down my hotel number and hung up. Truthfully, he was sounding pretty tired and weak, not nearly his old self. Well, he had a right to be, but at least there were no complications. My next call was going to be to David Roth, to check in on things at AppleCore, but first I wanted to order up some huevos rancheros, get some breakfast protein. I was becoming energized by the prospect of progress and being That way always makes me ravenous. It's probably a primal female response that has a Latin name. I checked out the number for room service and was literally reaching for the black phone when it rang of its own accord. Startled, I picked up the receiver, wondering who had my number. Hello. It was a man's voice that sounded vaguely familiar. Thought I'd check in and see how things are going with your search. Hi, I answered back after a pause, trying to place his intonation. Oh, sorry, Barry Morton. Remember me? Fortress America. You came by the office yesterday. How? Why was he calling me? How did you get this? You must have accidentally put the wrong hotel on your landing card as your address in Guatemala City. He hesitated a second, then said, but I had my secretary call around and well, it happens all the time. I see. It did have the ring of logic, and I had put down a different hotel, a safety measure. Do you always take this much interest in your fellow citizens? Only when they come to see me personally, he chuckled. So how's it going? Well, thanks for calling, I said. Everything's moving along. Good, good. There was another pause then. Incidentally, you having any luck finding that Nino's Del Mundo place you were looking for? I hesitated, wondering why he would ask and also unsure what to say. Not yet, I volunteered. My God, it finally dawned on me. The guy was tracking me. He wanted to know what I knew. You come up with anything at your end? I've been busy, a string of meetings, but I still think you might want to check out the phone book. It was the second time he'd made the suggestion. He was practically ordering me to do it. Why? You never know. I'm afraid that's about the best I can do. Maybe I will, I said. I've been a little busy too. The phone call was feeling stranger and stranger. He was sending me to see something, probably in hopes it would make me go away. It was actually more unnerving than if he'd done nothing at all. Well, in any case, I hope you have a good visit, he declared diplomatically. Another pause. Planning to be here? Long? I'm not sure yet. Why did he want to know that? I see. Whatever happens, I hope you find what you're looking for. Best of luck. He hung up, leaving me with the feeling he already knew the answer to every question he'd asked. Eyes at the airport, and now the embassy. I was the best-known tourist in the country. Okay, maybe I should just play along and see what happens. In any case, I just lost my appetite for fried eggs with hot sauce, but I had a definite interest in the phone book, and there they were. Nino's Del Mundo, complete with an address way out the Boulevard R. Aguilar batters. Well, why not see where it leads you? Sarah's card said the place was in the Peton, but who knows? I got up off the bed and went into the bathroom for a shampoo and shower. Despite the fact that Barry Morton wanted me to see this Nino's Del Mundo place, whatever it was, I didn't want to show up looking and smelling like some bedraggled tourist. I'd wear my tailored blue suit, which, along with the dark blue heels, ought to make me look adequately businesslike. The shower was wonderful, purging away the soot of the park, and I was wrapping my hair in a large beige towel when the phone jangled again. I tucked in the edge to secure it and walked over. Maybe it was Lou ringing back. No such luck. The caller was none other than my brand-new partner, Alan Duper. I was not thrilled to hear his voice. Was he about to get caught? Old feet and back out. Morgan, listen, he said, not wasting time on niceties. There's been a small change of plans. Alan, don't do this to me, you shit. You agreed. No, why I'm calling is, we've got to go ahead. Oh, up today, storm or no, God help us. You happy now? What? After that neurotic song and dance he'd just given me in the park, I should have been overjoyed, but something about the whole thing immediately felt synthetic. I paused a moment, trying to think the situation through. What was going on? The answer to that was clear as day. I was being set up. Somebody wanted me out of town, and they just found a way. Or was I being paranoid again? Had the weather cleared? I reached over and pushed aside a curtain. Nope, it looked as threatening as ever. No question. This was definitely a setup. On the other hand, why not use whoever had put him up to this? This told me for sure I was on the trail of Sarah, and the sooner I got going, the better. Aside from calling New York and then checking out the local Nino's Del Mundo that Barry Morton wanted me to see so badly, I had no other pressing plans. Alan, I thought you declared no. What effing way were you going to go today? I said, testing him. Why the sudden revision in scheduling? Yeah, well, something heavy's come up for tomorrow. I'm afraid it's gotta be now or forget it for at least a week. Unrefined bullshit. But somebody knew how badly I wanted to go. Look, there's something I need to check out first. I just learned about a place here in town I want to at least see. It's also called Nino's Del Mundo. No shit, he paused. Oak. We'll talk about it. Get the address and maybe we can cruise by if there's time. Thing is, we don't have all that much leeway here. One last question. I thought I'd give him a final shot at the truth. Just tell me honestly why, Has to be today, the real story. Like I said, everything's changed. He wasn't budging. So if we're doing this, I've got to pick you up now and get us on our merry way. He was too cheerful by half, which definitely told me he was lying. All right, but I really need to make at least one phone call first. I wanted Steve to know where I was. And if I walk out of here with a bag, I've got to let the desk know I'm not skipping on the bill. Forget the phone. No time. Do it after we get back. Just be out front in exactly 19 minutes. This is not a dry run. The train is leaving. I'm out of here now. There was a click and he was gone. I sat there a moment staring at the floor. What was I getting into? Well, there's one way to find out. Play their game and beat them. There's no better way to get inside what's going on. The first thing I did was call Steve's hotel in Belize City. Of course he wasn't there, but I left. A long message to the effect that I was taking a sightseeing trip up to the Peton with Alan Duper today, because of unforeseen new circumstances. The reasons were complicated, but I'd watch out for myself, and therefore he shouldn't. That out of the way, I looked around the room. It was a disaster, but I quickly began cramming things into the small, folding backpack I always took on trips. Then I rang the kitchen and told them to make up a quadruple egg sandwich. Cuatro huevos, por favor, to go along with a large bottle of distilled water. By the time I got to the reception desk and explained I wasn't actually checking out for good, Alan Duper was already waiting outside in his bath. Green Jeep, cleaning his scratchy shades and leaning on the horn. Let him wait. I wrote out a long note to Steve on the chance he might come looking for me. Then, with deliberate slowness, I wandered out to where Alan's Jeep was parked and tossed my backpack behind the seat. First things first. I climbed in and handed him the address of Nino's Del Mundo I'd copied onto some hotel stationery. This is where we've got to go. He stared at it a moment, puzzling, and then seemed to figure out where it was. Upscale, part of this beautiful oasis. He shifted into gear, but it's more or less on the way. He glanced up nervously at the sky. We just don't have all day. Off we headed toward the suburbs, through a ganglia of downtown streets laced with pizza joints and frying meat vendors, till we eventually ended up on a tree-lined avenue that looked as genteel as Oyster Bay. When we got to the address, I told him to park across the way and just sat a moment staring. The building itself was a windowless compound surrounded by trees and a high wall of white stucco, with a guardhouse and wide iron gate, not unusual for Guatemala, protecting a walkway. The whole thing looked like a fortress, except the view through the gate was a pastoral vista of neat flower beds and a pristine lawn. The guardhouse itself had a dozing teenager, undoubtedly with an Uzi resting across his lap. Okay, Alan, I said, time to get with the program. How's your Spanish? Depends on who I'm trying to BS. He shrugged and began cleaning his sunglasses again. Well, why don't you see if you can talk us past that guard? He stared at the entrance a moment. Be a waste of our precious time. Tell you right now, kids like that only answer to one boss, the Jeef, the big guy, whoever he is. That's how they retain their employment. A joint locked down this tight don't give unday tours. Well, I think he's asleep, so I'm going to be creative and see if there's a back entrance of some kind, maybe a service area that'll give me some idea of what's going on here. Do what you want, but make it fast. He's Ed, leaning back in the seat, and try not to get shot. I carefully got out and walked down the empty street away, then followed the stucco wall/fence. The building covered an entire city block until I came across an alley entrance with another large iron gate, padlocked shut. I peered up the driveway, shrouded in overhanging trees, but there was nothing in the parking lot except a couple of army jeeps and a black Land Rover. Well, Barry Morton really wanted me to see this. But why? Is there a connection to the place in the Peton? And what are the army vehicles all about? I sighed and made my way back to the street. When I reached the Jeep, Alan was gone, but then I realized he was over talking to the young guard, offering him a cigarette. A few moments later, he waved goodbye and casually ambled back. Okay. He settled in and hit the ignition. Here's the official deal. This place is some kind of hospice for unwed mothers. They also take in orphans, or so he thinks. According to him, no American women have ever had anything to do with the place, which is probably why I'd never heard of it. He glanced at me as we sped off. You happy now? Debriefing. Army dudes is a specialty of mine, so I think that's probably the straight scoop. Did you ask if it's connected with something in the Peton? I was still hoping. In any case, whatever it was, I was collecting more pieces of the puzzle. Hey, give me a break. He shifted up, gaining speed. I know when to push, and this wasn't the precise moment. The kid was itchy enough as it was. Like, who the fuck are you, gringo, and what are you doing here? I got all I could get, Without a cold cerveza. He glanced over. You ask me, a little gratitude wouldn't be entirely out of place. Okay, muchas gracias, amigo. Happy now? Ecstatic. The Jeep was open, and I checked out the sky, which was growing darker and more threatening by the minute. The promised foul weather still seemed to be just that, promised, but it was definitely on the way. Alan Duper must really be scared. Finally, I leaned back in the torn plastic seat and closed my eyes. Was this Nino's Del Mundo, the Latin branch of Children of Light, the place where Alex Goddard's babies came from? Considering the interest Colonel Ramos had in my movie, the Army Jeeps could be a tip-off. Also, there seemed to be an Eve, and chance that Barry Morton was involved somehow. But it was all still guesswork. And anyway, this wasn't the place Sarah had put on her landing card. That Nino's Del Mundo was somewhere up north, hidden in the rainforest. Ready or not? It's SAR, hang on. Chapter 19. What did he say? I asked, not quite catching the burst of rapid-fire Spanish from the cockpit. The explosion of expletives had included the word navgashion, something about malfunction, God help us. Alan Duper's hell. A copter reminded me of the disintegrating taxis on Guatemala City's potholed streets. The vibration in the passenger compartment was so violent it made my teeth chatter. My stomach felt like it was in a cocktail shaker, and the deafening roar could have been the voice of hell. I was staring out the smudgy plastic window, where less than 300 meters below I could just make out the top of the Peton rainforest of northwest Guatemala sweeping by beneath us. So this was what it looked like. Dense and impenetrable, it was a yawning, deciduous carpet enveloping the earth as far as the eye could see, if something 10 stories high could be called carpet. I'd been in the forests of India's Kerala and seen some of the denser growth in southern Mexico, but this was like another planet. The main problem was a violent downpour. The leading edge of the hurricane was now sweeping across the Yucatan, stirring up the treetops of the jungles. Below, the rain, which had begun in earnest about 10 minutes after we got airborne, had been steadily increasing to the point it was now almost blinding. This was the risk I'd chosen to take, but let me admit right here, the weather had me seriously scared, my fingernails digging into the armrests and my pulse erratic. And now was there something else? We'd only been in the air for 35 minutes, and already we had some kind of mechanical issue looming. What was left? A go wrong? Some of the lights went out or something. Duper tried to shrug. I'm not sure. No big deal, though. This old bird always gets the job done. His pilot, Lieutenant Villatoro, formerly of the Guatemalan Army, had just shouted the new development back to the cabin. Probably nothing. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. His tourist helicopter was a Guatemalan candidate for the Air and Space Museum, an old Bell UH-1D patched. together with chicle and corn masa. Surely the storm was pushing it far beyond its stress limits. Right, but what exactly? Sounds like the nav station. He clicked open his seat belt. Something who knows. If you'd be happier, I'll go. Up and look. I felt my palms go cold. Doesn't seem too much to ask, considering. The world down below us was a hostile melange of towering trees, all straining for the sky, while the ground itself was a dark tangle of ferns, lianas, strangler vines, creepers among which lurked Olympic scorpions and some of the earth's most poisonous snakes. If we had to set down here, I didn't even want to think about it. To lower a helicopter into the waves of flickering green below us would be to confront the hereafter. It's just the lights, like he said. Duper yelled back from the cockpit's door, letting a tone of, "I told you to chill out," seep through. He was peering past the opening at the long line of instruments. He followed his announcement with a sigh as he moved back into the main cabin. Relax. I wasn't relaxed, and from the way his eyes were shifting and his Gaulois cigarettes were being chain-smoked, he was on the verge of a nervous break. Down. In his case, it wasn't just the weather. He was fidgeting like a trapped animal, giving me the distinct sense he was doing someone's invisible bidding and was terrified he might fail. Well, why don't you try and fix it? Was he trying to act calm just to impress me? Can't you bang on the panel or something? Okay, let me see what I can do. Jesus. He edged back into the cockpit, next to Villatoro. The wind was shaking us so badly that, even bent over, he was having trouble keeping his balance. Then he half-heartedly slammed the dark instrument readouts with the heel of his open hand. When the effort produced no immediate electronic miracle, he settled into the co-pilot's seat. Que pasa? He yelled at Villatoro, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine and the plastering of rain on the fuselage. Then he looked out the windscreen at the torrent slamming against it and rubbed at his chin. No. My comandante, the Guatemalan shouted back. I sensed he was hoping to sound efficient and unperturbed. Duper claimed his pilot had personally checked out the bell and prepped it. Now though, Mira. Like I said, the lights, on the nav station. Maybe the electrical. How about the backup battery? Duper was just barely keeping his cool. Villatoro scratched his chin. I'll tell you the truth. The backup is muerto. I tested it before we left, but I couldn't find any replacements in provisions. I figure, no problem, but now, amigo, I felt another wave of dismay, right into my churning stomach. Well, keep your heading north. Duper's voice was coming from a place of extreme pain. And if you sight the Rio Tiger, then Balam or whatever should be more or less due west, according to what I'm assuming. Just keep your eyes open. He paused. Problem is, with all this rain, the river's going to be tough to make out. I redoubled my efforts to peer out the window, searching, my breath coming in bursts. Still nothing. Dear God, what now? Finally Duper headed back, bracing himself against the firewall as he crouched and passed through the door into the main cabin. When he settled into the seat across from me, he was glaring at me as though everything was my fault. You know, he was yelling again. I'm beginning to think maybe we ought to try to find a clearing and just sit out this crap till morning. He leaned over and peered down through the bell's spattered side windows at the dense tangle of growth below. After a moment, he got up and once more moved toward the cockpit, still with the same troubled look. This time, however, he was beaming as he shouted back. There may be a God after all. I think we just intersected the Rio Tiger. We can bear due west now along the river. We could be getting close if it's where I think it is. I turned and stared down again, barely making out the thread of the stream through the rain. Yes, maybe there's hope. Still, below us the wind-blown treetops were a solid mass of pastel sparkles, a dancing sea of hungry green, but then I thought I saw something. Hey, it might even be a clearing. I quickly unbuckled and made my way up to the cockpit, hanging on to anything I could grasp. Alan, look, I yelled, and pointed off to the side, out through the rain-obscured windscreen. I think we just passed over thing back there, see? Where? He squinted. You can still just make it out. I twisted and kept pointing. I was biting my lip, trying to hold together. There it looks like some kind of clearing. Maybe I don't know, but what if we just sat down there and let this storm blow over? He ordered Villatoro to bank and go back for a look. A few moments later, it was obvious there was an opening in the trees. Yeah, let's check it out. He then said something to Villet. Oro and we started easing toward it, definitely a wide opening. The billowing ocean of trees below us seemed to be parting like the Red Sea as we settled in. There had to be solid ground down there somewhere. Had to be. I was ointing. There, over to the side, it's a kind of hill or something. It's where... Duper squinted again, his voice starting to crack. Then he focused in. Yeah, maybe there's something there. Hard to tell what it is, though. But I guess we're about to find out. He gestured to the lieutenant, barking an order in quick Spanish. While the bell kept moving lower through the opening, Duper flicked on the landing lights and appeared to be muttering a prayer of thanks. I was staring out, growing ever more puzzled. A hill was there, all right. The problem was it was definitely man-made, topped by a stone building. I could just make it out in the glare of the lights. What do you think that is? What do I think? Duper studied the scene for a moment longer, and then his face melted into the first smile I'd seen since we left. I think we are lucky beyond belief. God help us, we may have found it. That could be the damned pyramid or whatever's supposed to be up here. He leaned back. Yeah, congratulations. Look at that damned thing. Either this is the place, or we're about to become the archaeologists of the year. Cover of Time, the Nobel Frigging Prize. At that moment, I almost wanted to hug Alan Duper. But not quite. Instead, I moved farther into the cockpit, trying to get a look out the windscreen. By then, we had lowered well through the opening in the trees, the helicopter's controls fighting against the blowing rain, and it felt as though we'd begun descending into the ocean's depths in a diving bell, surrounded by thrashing, wind-whipped branches. Now, though, I was staring at the ghostly rise of the pyramid emerging out of the rain. It looks brand new. Yeah, the whole place is Uncle Disneyland, remember? Except this deal ain't about Mickey Mouse, believe me. There's plenty of army hanging out around here. Lieutenant Villatoro took us ever lower, gently guiding the chopper's descent, and now we were only a few feet above the ground. There certainly was no mistaking what was around us, even with the blowing rain. The pyramid loomed over one side of a large plaza, a big paved area that was mostly obscured from the skies since the swaying trees arched over and covered it from aerial view. Okay, we're about to touch down. Duper was clawing at his pocket, yearning for a cigarette. So if you still want to get out, move over by the door. I'll disengage the main rotor once we're on the ground. As we settled in, the rotor began to cause surface effect, throwing a spray off the paving stones, which now glistened under the cold beam of the landing lights. And looming above us, off to the right, was a stepped pyramid in the classic Mayan style. We all lapsed into silence as the bell's skids thumped onto the stones. The ex-army pilot, Villatoro, kept glancing over at the pyramid as though he didn't want to admit even seeing it. Did he know something, Alan? And I didn't. This was the moment I'd been bracing for. I was increasingly convinced somebody wanted me to see this place, whatever it was. But now, what should I do? Well, the first thing was to dip my toe in the water, do a quick recon. Oiter on the ground. If this really was Balam, Duper's Maya Disneyland, could it also be part of Alex Goddard's Clinic of Miracles, the location Sarah called Nino's Del Mundo? If I knew that for sure, then I could start figuring how to find out if she was here, as I suspected, and get her out of his clutches. Maybe the See No Evil embassy might even be prodded into helping an American citizen for a change. I'm getting out, to look around a little, but not till you turn off the engine. I want to be able to use my ears. All right, but don't take all day. This kind of weather, I want to keep it warm. He turned to Villatoro and shouted the order. In the sheets of pounding rain, I figured that no one could have heard us come in. That, at least, was positive. When the RPMs of the engine had died away, I clicked open the bell's wide door, slid it back, and looked around. In the glare of the landing lights, I realized it. That the stones were old, weathered, and worn, but the grout that sealed them was white and brand new. The plaza was free of moss, clean as the day it was done, which did not appear to be all that long ago. Above me, the pyramid continued This recessed tiers of glistening stones towered into the dim skyline of trees. I stepped out onto the pavement, holding my breath. The plaza was almost football field in size, reminding me of an Italian piazza. Around me the rain was lessening slightly, and as my eyes adjusted, my God, there wasn't just a pyramid here. Through the sparkle of raindrops at the edge of the helicopter's lights, I could see what looked like a wide cobblestone walkway leading into the den. Its growth just off the edge of the square, probably toward the south, away from the river, connecting the plaza with distant groups of small, thatch-roofed houses, set in clusters. Could Alex Goddard's miracle clinic be in some collection of Prim? It of huts. It made no sense, but I decided to try to get a closer look. I'd walked about 30 feet away from the helicopter, across the slippery paving, when I saw a flash of lightning in the southeast, followed by a boom of thunder. That echoed over the square. At least I thought it was thunder. Or maybe the army was holding heavy artillery practice somewhere nearby. Abruptly, the rain turned into a renewed torrent, and the next thing I heard was the helicopter's engine start up again. Then I sensed the main rotor engage, a sudden whoom, whoom, whoom quickly spiraling upward in frequency. Hey! I told him not to when I looked back at the bell's open door. Duper was standing there, frantically searching. The dark as he heaved out my tan backpack and what looked like a rolled-up sleeping bag, both splashing down onto the rain-soaked paving. What? For a moment I thought the thunder, or whatever it was, must have completely freaked him. Then what was actually happening hit me with a horrifying impact. Alan, wait! I started dashing back, but now the main rotor was creating a powerful downdraft, throwing the rain into me like a monsoon. By the time I managed to fight my way through the spray, the rotor was on full power, and Alan Duper and his bell were already lifting off. I reached up and just managed to brush one greasy skid as he churned away straight upward into the rainy night. You shit, I yelled. Up, but my final farewell was lost in the whine of the engine. My God, I thought, watching him disappear, I've just been abandoned hundreds of miles deep in a Central American rainforest. Then it all sank in. Whoever had gotten to him was playing a rough game. They didn't want me just to see Balam. They wanted me delivered here. Probably to secure me in the same place Sarah was. Colonel Ramos, or whoever had frightened Duper into bringing me, had wanted us. Both. So what now? Were we both going to be disappeared? Staring around at the pyramid and the empty square, I could feel my heart pounding. Then I tripped over the rolled sleeping bag and sank to my knees there in the middle of the rain sweat. The plaza, soaked to the skin and so angry I was actually trembling. Up above me, Alan Duper, king of two-timers, had switched off his landing lights, and a few moments later the hum of the bell was swallowed by the night sounds of the forest, the high-pitched din of crickets, the piercing call of night birds, the basso groan of frogs celebrating the storm, and something else, an eerie sense of the unnatural. I can't explain it. Even the night songs of the birds felt ominous. A primeval forest reasserting its will. It was haunting, like nature's mockery of my desolation. I pounded the sleeping bag and felt shit. How did I let this happen get a grip? I finally stood up and looked around. Maybe when God wants to do you up right, she gives you what you want. You used Alan Duper just like you intended. He got you here. But there's more to the plan of whoever's holding his puppet strings. So the thing now is, don't let yourself be manipulated anymore. Get off your soggy butt and start taking control of the situation. That was when I sighted a white form at the south forested edge of the plaza. What? I ducked down, sure it was somebody lurking there, waiting. A try to beat me to death as they had Sarah. Did Ramos intend to just murder me immediately? But there was no getting away. If I could see them, they surely could see me. And where would I escape to anyway? I dug my yellow plastic flashlight out of my backpack and my hand shaking, flicked it on. The beam, however, was just swallowed up in the rain. All right. I strapped on the pack and taking a deep breath, threw the rolled sleeping bag over my shoulder and headed across the lippery paving toward the white, which now glistened in the periodic sheets of distant lightning. Meet them straight on. Try and bluff. When I got closer, though, I realized what I was seeing was actually just the skin of a jaguar. Blah. Each white, the head still on, fearsome teeth bared which had been hung beside the paved pathway. Thank God, but then, playing my light over it, I thought, bad sign. My first encounter at Balam is with a spooky, dead cat. It felt like a chilling omen of I wasn't sure what. I studied it a moment longer with my flashlight, shivering, then turned and headed quickly across the plaza toward the pyramid now barely visible in the rain. If there were jaguars, or God knows what else around, I figured I'd be safer up at the top. When I reached the base and shined my light up the steps, I saw they were steeper than I'd thought. But they also looked to be part of some meticulous restoration, and brand new, probably. Afe to climb, and there at the top was a stone hut, complete with what appeared to be a roof. Good. If there hadn't been anything taller than it around, I think I might have just climbed a tree. On the way up, I began trying to digest what the play really was. The pyramid was fake. Or was it? 100 years ago, the eccentric Brit archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans whimsically reconstructed the Palace of Minos on Crete with his own money, and it's still a tourist highlight. So why couldn't somebody do the same with a reclaimed Mayan pyramid in Central America? Still, this was different, had the feel of being somebody's crazed obsession. As I topped the steps, I realized the building that crowned the pyramid. It was also a restoration like everything else, including a decorated wooden lintel above the door that looked to be newly lacquered. Bizarre. I moved through the door and unloaded my gear, then extracted my water bottle, now half-empty, for a pull. Finally, I unrolled Alan Duper's sleeping bag on the dry stone floor, removed and spread out my wet clothes, peed off the edge, then took a new pair of underpants, jeans, and shirt out of my backpack, donned them, and easily crawled in. I was shivering, whether from the soaking rain or from fright, I didn't know, and my teeth were trying to chatter. Was I hidden away enough to be safe? I didn't know. All I did know was, I was in something deeper than I'd ever been in my life, and I had no idea how I was going to get out, and I was both scared to death and angry as hell. Sarah was here, though, I was certain. Like a sixth sense, I could feel her presence, out there somewhere in the rain. For a moment, I was tempted to just plunge into the storm looking for her, but a split-second's reflection told me that was the stupidest thing I could do. Instead, I should try and get some rest till the storm cleared and keep periodic watch on the plaza in case somebody showed up. Then, the minute there was light, I'd hit the ground and go find her. I suppose nothing ever happens the way you plan. My mind was racing and my nerves were in the red, but I was so exhausted from the teeth-rattling trip in the bell I couldn't really stay alert very long. In spite of myself, I eventually drifted off into a dreamless doze, a victim of the narcotic song of wind in the giant sebia trees and the insistent drumming of forest rain on the roof. Chapter 20. I awoke as a sliver of sun flashed through the stone doorway of the room and forest birds erupted around me in celebration. As I pulled myself up and moved over to the opening, a quick tropical glare burned into my face. My God, the dawn was electric. It was the purest blue I'd ever seen, a swath of artist's cobalt. An azure radiance from the sky glistened off the rain-forest leaves around me. Had I dreamed the stormy, haunted world of the Nile? Before, when I looked down, everywhere below me was a bank of dense, pastel mist. Was the plaza really there, or had I imagined it? I felt like the top of the pyramid was floating on a cloud. Babylon. That was what Sarah had called this place, ancient and mysterious. I took a breath of the morning air and wondered what would draw her back here. Was Balam the ultimate escape from her other life? Even so, why would she want to return after somebody had tried to murder her? What was waiting down there in the fog? Turning back, I noticed that the room's inside walls were embossed with rows and rows of classic Mayan glyphs, like little cartoon faces, all molded in newly set plaster. To my groggy sight, they seemed layful, harmless little caricatures, though next to them were raised bas-reliefs of warriors in battle dress. It was both sublimely austere and eerie, even creepy. I knelt down and rolled my sleeping bag, trying to clear my head. Then I stuffed my still moist clothes into my backpack and thought about the river, the Rio Tiger, down somewhere at the back of the pyramid. And I felt my pulse rate edging up. The first thing I wanted to do was see it in the light of day. It had been Sarah's way out, the only thing I knew for sure she'd touched. Get going and do it. I headed through the rear door and down the back steps. When I reached the ground, the dense forest closed in around me, but I was certain the river lay it ahead, through the tangle of trees. As I moved down a path that grew ever steeper, the canopy up above thickened, arching over me till it blotted out the pure blue of the sky. And the air was filled with nature sounds, bird calls, trills, songs, and clacks, all mingled with the hum and buzz of insects. Then, suddenly, from somewhere up in the canopy, a pack of screeching spider monkeys began flinging rotten mangoes down in my direction. I also thought I heard the asthmatic, territorial, real roar of a giant howler monkey, the lord of the upper jungle. And what about snakes? I kept an eye on the vines and tendrils alongside the path, expecting any moment to stumble across a deadly fer-de-lance, a little red and black opera, whose poison heads straight for your nervous system. On the other hand, the birds, the forest birds, were everywhere, scarlet macaws and keel-billed toucans and darting flocks of Amazon parrots. Brilliant and iridescent, their sweeping tail was a psychedelic rainbow of green, yellow, red. Then the next thing I knew, the path I was on abruptly opened onto a mossy expanse of pea-soup green. Surely the Rio Tiger, and my God, those dark brown bumps scattered everywhere there. The eyes and snouts of, yes, crocodiles, lurking there in wait, hoping I'm dumb enough to wade in. Forget what Alan Duper said. This is definitely not Disneyland. Then I glanced upstream and caught sight of a string of mahogany dugout canoes tied along the shore. They were huge, about 15 feet long and 3 feet wide, and clearly designed to be crocodile-resistant. Wait a minute. Lou said Sarah was found in a dugout canoe that had drifted all the way down the Rio Tiger to where it joins the Usumacinta. One more clue she might have been here. Maybe I was closing in. Yes, I glared back at the crocodile's unblinking reptile eyes and tried to get my mind around the fact Sarah could have stood right where I was standing or been set adrift from here in a coma to float downstream. Seeing that vision, I felt unbidden tears trailing down my cheeks, and the questions I had kept piling up. Was this the location of Alex Goddard's miracle clinic? Why was Balam such a high-security secret? What was the connection between this place and Sarah's ravaged mind and body? I wanted to know all of it, and by God I would. This was the farthest I'd ever been from civilization, though I was trying not to let that fact sink in too deeply. The water was green and full of small aquatic creations, but I managed to find a reasonably unmossy spot and still keeping an eye on the leering crocodiles ashed my face. It felt good, even if it was filthy. Okay, I'd seen enough of the river. I raised up and stretched. Time to go. My hopes at war with my nerves, I turned my back on the scummy, fetid Rio Tiger and headed back up the jungle trail toward the plaza. When I got there, I was struck all over again by the vision of the pyramid. Something like it might have been here originally, but in any case it had been completely redone, with newly cut yellowish stones and white lime plaster, an exotic castle nestled in the green lap of the rainforest, rising above the square like a haunting presence. It must have been well over 100 feet high, a stone wedding cake with a dozen steep tiers between the ground and the platform at the top, which also was square and roughly 15 feet on the side. Standing there gazing at it, I think I'd never felt more disoriented. Sarah. How could we both end up here, at the last outpost of the world? But seeing is believing. I took a deep breath, then turned down the pathway toward the thatch-roofed huts, Through the mist it was gradually becoming clear that Balam actually was a village, and a sizable one. The walkway led past a string of clearings, each with clusters of one-room huts built in the ancient classical style, with walls of mud over rows of vertical saplings, their roofs and porches peaked with yellow-green thatch weathering to browns and grays. The structures, outlined starkly against the towering green arbor of the forest above, were grouped around paved patios. It all was neat and meticulous, like a jungle brigadoon, although the effects of the storm were everywhere blown thatch and bamboo. I still felt as if I'd fallen into a time warp where clocks had gone backward. Then I began to catch the outlines of people, as though they had materialized out of the pale fog. All pure Maya, short and brown, shiny black hair. They appeared to be just going about their daily lives. I was approaching a workshop area where, under a wide thatch shade, men with chipped flint adzes were carving bowls, plows, various implements from mahogany and other rainforest woods. Next to them, potters were fashioning brown clay jugs. They all were wearing white loincloths and a large square cotton cloth knotted around their shoulders, their hair tied back in dense ponytails. It must have been how the Maya looked 1,000 years ago. Their earnestness reminded me of the villagers I once filmed in the Yucatan for the Discovery Channel, with one big difference. There I was the big shot gringo. Here I felt like a powerless time traveler. The sense of being lost in a Their age was as compelling as the colonial mock-up at Williamsburg, but this was real, and it was decidedly spooky. Finally, one of the men looked up and noticed me. Our eyes locked for an instant. It seemed like forever, and then he reached over and, in a way that seemed breathless, shook the man next to him, gesturing toward me. Together they gazed back as though viewing a phantom, their brown faces intent. And then they turned and called out to the others, alerting them. What are they going to do with me? I wondered with a sudden chill. A stranger here in their hideaway midst. Would they just turn on me, find some women, get off the street? I turned and headed as fast as I could down the cobblestone central, till I saw a cluster of females on a whitewashed stone porch, long hair falling over their shoulders as they bent to their tasks beneath the thatch overhangs. Some were stirring rugged clay pots of corn soaking in lime. Others were grinding the softened maize to tortilla thinness on wide granite platters. Behind them was another group that appeared to be part of a sewing commune, young wives busy at their backstrap looms, layering thread after thread of dyed cotton. None of them was airing a huiple, the traditional multicolored blouse I'd remembered from the waitresses in the restaurant. Instead, they all had on a kind of handloom-woven white shift I'd never seen before. Talk to them. Let them know you're no threat to anybody. As I moved down the hard clay pathway toward them, two looked up and took notice. Their first reaction seemed to be alarm as they tensed and stared. But then I tried a smile and it seemed to work. Their looks turned to puzzlement then. Embarrassed grins, as though they wanted to be friendly but weren't sure how to acknowledge my presence. When I reached the porch, several reached out to touch me. One older woman, short and wizened and extremely brown, even tried to stroke my hair. What was going on? I was taken aback, but I also was determined to get through to them. Why not just ask them point blank if Sarah's here? Is there any chance they understand Spanish? Buenos dias. I smiled and nodded. Dispensime, quiero descubrir. Esta una gringa de los Estados Unidos aquí? They all returned uncomprehending looks, then glanced quickly at each other in confusion, or at least that was how I read their faces. Sarah, I said, pronouncing the name slowly. Sarah Crenshaw. Sarah, one voice, then others. They backed away and immediately began a heated dispute which eventually involved all the women. Well, one thing was for sure, they damned well knew I was asking about, but why were they so upset? Next, several of them grew testy, pointing at me as they continued to argue. Finally, the two I'd first approached turned and began urging me to leave, gesturing at me with their hands as though sweeping me out of the compound. Yes, there was no mistaking. I was being dismissed, and I detected an odd nervousness as they glanced around, seemingly worried somebody might catch me there with them. I got the feeling they'd finally decided they didn't want me anywhere near them, since they kept pointing down the thoroughfare in the direction of the pyramid. I've blown it, I thought. They must have figured out I'm here to get her, and decided they no longer want to have anything to do with me. What did that mean, and now what do I do? As I retreated back out to the main walkway, I felt a growing sense of defeat. Then looking down it, I realized I'd literally been going in a circle. It was actually a large oval that curved back to the main square and the pyramid where I'd started from. God, what a nightmare. I obviously had to rethink my game plan, find a way to communicate. And on top of that, I was dying of thirst. I fished out the almost empty plastic container from my backpack, then walked across the square and settled myself on the first step leading up the steep front. As I drew on the bottle, my mind still swirling, I happened to notice an upright stone slab off to the side, like a tall, thin tombstone, with a bas-relief of a Maya warrior on it, next to some kind of two-headed serpent god, probably Kukulkan, one of the few Maya deities I knew. And then, down the side, were O's of lines and dots. I studied them a minute before realizing it was the classical Mayan number system, telling precisely when things happened to the ruler shown there. Born on such and such a date, assumed the kingship, won great battle, etc., all carefully dated as career high points. I knew that dots represented single years, horizontal lines the number 5. The Maya loved numbers and numerology, so that was when I glanced up to see a group of women approaching slowly across the square, with a bunch of the men watching from the forest arbors beyond, and they were huddled around something they were carrying. Whatever it was, they seemed to be delivering it to me. Then I realized they were the same ones who just kicked me out of their compound. What next? Are they coming to drive me from the plaza too? Should I try and forcibly search all the huts? But then they set down their load. It turned out to be a crude bamboo and thatch palanquin. In and stepped aside as they beckoned me forward. For a moment I just stared, disbelieving. I felt like I was seeing someone I didn't want to recognize, perhaps because that someone looked so much like me. Morgie, they told me a new one was here, and I hoped it was you. Sarah was swinging her skinny legs off the side, her voice bright. Her face was drawn, but her hair was neat, and her eyes were radiant. Isn't Balam the most wonderful place you've ever seen? He was wearing a white shift that reminded me of the blue hospital smock she'd had on the last time I saw her. Except here, it seemed more like something that had a special significance, like the robes of an acolyte. Her shoes were soft brown, slippers that looked brand new, and around her waist was a braided leather band. As I stared at her, I wondered if she was really as transformed as she looked. She was undeniably stronger than 2 days ago, in spite of what that bastard Alex Oddard and his Guatemalan army cronies had done to her to get her here. But still, she had to be half dead. Thank God Lou couldn't see her now. Sar, oh Sar, I rushed over and threw my arms around her. She'd been freshly bathed and perfumed a fragrance like chocolate, but she felt like a bag of bones. Are you okay? I was afraid Balam was all just a dream. She hugged me back, then started rising to her feet. God, could she walk? But now I remember everything. Sar, I've come to take you home. I grasped her hand, warm and soft, to help her stand though it wasn't necessary. You're not safe. No, it's wonderful now. Then she turned and said something to one of the women. It took me a moment to realize she was speaking their language. I guessed it was Kekchai Maya. I was stunned. How did she learn it? Finally, she looked back at me and switched to English again. I didn't understand before. I was sick so much. Come on. I slipped my arm around her. We're going to get you out of here. I'd never felt so helpless. Alan Duper had said there was a road, but it was controlled by the army. Right now, I didn't even know where it was. Maybe I could find a phone or radio, call the embassy. There must be something. Alex Goddard has to be here somewhere, but he's not going to stop me. I'll strangle him if he tries. I hugged her again, the feel of her skin and bones frame May. King, my soul ache. But most hurtful of all, I wasn't sure she would want to leave. Sar, can you understand me? I tried to catch her deep blue eyes. I'm taking you home. Your father's very worried about you. Mention of Lou seemed. I finally get through to her. She turned and examined me with a quizzical look, and then her eyes hardened. Morgie, he was never there for me. Her voice was filled with certainty and pain. But when I went to see Dr. Goddard, he come here for the ceremony. It's so spiritual. After, Sar, come on. What did she mean by ceremony? Whatever it was, I had to get her out of this place, immediately. Are you here for the ceremony? Her face flooded with Renee. Ood joy. It's 2 days from now. Maybe he'll let you. She should be resting. It was a harsh voice directly behind us. I recoiled, then whirled around. 3 men were standing there, 2 of them young privates in uniforms of the Guadi. Malin Army, and carrying AK-47 assault rifles. The ones with the long, ominous curved clip Steve called Quino de Cabrio, the horn of the goat. The third was in a black sweatshirt and black jeans, his long sultan pepper hair tied back in a ponytail. They should have known better than to bring her out here, Alex Goddard said. Not in her condition, the bastard. It was all coming together in my mind. He'd tried to kill her once before, and now he was going. Finish the job, but he'd have to kill me first. I'm here to take her home. I marched up to him. You're not about to get away with kidnapping. I'm going to get the embassy to. She's here for important medical reasons. He met my eyes. I hope you'll allow me the opportunity to help her. What do you mean, help? I'll explain if you'll give me a chance. He revolved and delivered some brusque orders in Kekshai Maya to the women, who nodded apologetically and began helping Sarah back onto the palanquin. After he admonished her in the same language, he then said something in quick Spanish to the 2 young army privates, who gave him a firm salute, turned, and walked over to pick the palanquin up to carry it for the women. The sense of authority he exuded reminded me of that first morning we met at Quetzal Manor. His eyes flashed from benign to demanding to benign in an instant. No, damn it, Alto? I strode over, shoved the soldiers aside and took her hand. Sar, honey, don't you understand what's going on? Something terrible happened to you when you were here before. I'm so worried. But he says I need to stay, Morgie. She drew back. It's best. He's helping me. As I watched the 2 privates carry her away, down the cobblestone pathway, AK-47s swung over their shoulders, I felt my helplessness become complete. The army here was under his control, just like everything else. How was I going to tell Lou about this, that Sarah had been brainwashed? Whatever Alex Goddard had done to her had turned her into some kind of Mooney, ready to denounce her own father. So now did I have 2 battles to wage. One with Alex Goddard and one with her. Then he walked over to me. I'm not going to ask how you got here, though I assume it wasn't easy. He smiled like a kindly priest and put his hand on my shoulder. But however you did it, I'm glad you decided to come. It's important for you to be here. She needs you now.